So, 1999 had some of my favorite games ever to be released, some of which are still my favorite in their respective series today. Digimon World 1, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and of course, what this video is gonna be about, Final Fantasy VIII. In 1997, Squaresoft released the critically acclaimed Final Fantasy VII, becoming quite possibly the most popular JRPG in the West up to that point in history, possibly even to this point today. The genre had existed for a while, but this was the first one to get such a positive response on the scale at which it did. For many, Final Fantasy VII was their first true JRPG they had ever played, and 8 being the sequel caused many people to make comparisons between the two. The scope and scale of 7 being about a group of eco-terrorists trying to save the world with a grand number of well-developed plot twists and other threads cast a large shadow over the next entry in the series. Final Fantasy VIII was a game that was centered around a tale of romance. It had a world-saving adventure to it too, but it was not nearly as central to the plot as it was for 7. Not only that, but Squaresoft really wanted to branch out and try a whole bunch of new things with the game, a concept which seems foreign to most modern game devs. The game was less fantastical and more grounded in reality than any other game in the series, resulting in a more realistic game, and maybe not quite suited for a series with fantasy in the title. This video will be analyzing the plot and criticisms of Final Fantasy VIII that it has received throughout the many years and tries to address them all. I do wonder if the game would have received as much of a backlash had it been a game with no relation to the FF series at all. On one hand, the FF brand would boost sales, but on the other, that brand comes with its own presuppositions as to what kind of game it should be. FF8 doesn't follow most of the series that came before it. There are no crystals, humans don't even know magic naturally, there's modern-age cities with cars and spaceships and secret research laboratories, and even its own fucking trading card game. Yes, magic does exist in this world, but it's far less magical than in the other games in the series. It's bound to technology. But that just leads to a whole other issue with all the changes to the core game mechanics that Square wanted to try. Keep in mind, this is not a review video, but an analysis, which is impossible to do without spoilers, so consider this your warning. You may end up enjoying the game even more now knowing ahead of time what happens, so if you're on the fence about getting this game, maybe you'll enjoy this video anyway. For those of you who don't want spoilers, but want a general idea of what I'm about to discuss, Final Fantasy VIII has a tendency to build up tension, mystery, and plot before actually revealing things. Sometimes it works well in my opinion, sometimes not quite so well. I think a lot of people just get impatient with the game though, and that's what this video is seeking to address. I'll go over the entire plot of FF8 and then do the analysis section afterwards. So without further ado, here is the 100% best and completely factually accurate plot synopsis of FF8. Squall Leonhardt is our main character. He is a broody angster emo soldier dude with memory problems. Actually, he is a 17-year-old student at a military academy to become an elite soldier called Seed. The game starts with an amazing orchestral arrangement between he and his rival, Cypher, fighting with some weird mumbo-jumbo trailer shenanigans happening at the same time. It ends with Cypher and Squall injuring one another, and then changes scenes to Squall waking up in an infirmary. When this game came out, these were some of the greatest graphics that ever existed. These FMV cutscenes, I mean. The remaster changes a lot of the models so you can't quite see the original graphics based off of that, but the original game's graphics were truly mesmerizing for a kid in 1999. Squaresoft must have noticed this, because shortly after waking up, there's an FMV introducing your 18-year-old instructor, and damn is she looking fine. She also uses a whip in battle. Not that that matters to the plot, but it's really fucking hot. Anyway, your teacher is named Quiznos? I mean, she is hot, and I'd have loved her to sub for one of my teachers when I was younger. But let's go with Quiznos, which I think is the official pronunciation. Quiznos picks up Squall, and they go to class together. At this point, the camera zooms out, and another FMV plays with an amazing BGM playing and shows the grand scale of the military school, which is apparently as large as several towns in this game. Also, I'd like to note just how cool it is that there are many FMV sequences in this game where you still control your characters and can move around despite having a moving background at times. Like they actually programmed you being able to move, but spent enough time to prevent you from accidentally moving out of bounds or something similar. It doesn't really mean all that much to most people, but I really appreciated this. I thought it was cool back then, and this BGM that plays whenever in Balamb Garden has become one of the most memorable BGMs to me of all time. Ever since this game, I couldn't think of school without thinking of this BGM. Later in my life, another BGM started doing the same thing as well, that being the school theme from Persona 3. Anyway, this is just one of the many amazing BGMs in Final Fantasy VIII. Like, all the Final Fantasy games up to 10 had amazing OSTs in general, so if anyone told me that their favorite OST came from a different FF game, I totally understand, but FF8 will always have my favorite in the series. Uematsu's genius was on full display in this game, with very effective uses of leitmotifs compared to most other Final Fantasy games. For example, one of the most famous musical pieces from this game is a vocal song called Eyes on Me, but there's several instances in-game where the same melody is played as a part of different BGMs, building up to the moment where Eyes on Me is actually played. Back in this day, games didn't have voice acting, so BGMs were the way emotion was conveyed during certain cutscenes. This results in some things I need to talk about in Final Fantasy VIII that I think goes largely underappreciated. Several times, things are hinted at but never outright spoken in the game. It gives enough information for the player to infer things, but it doesn't spoon feed, and I really like that. It's one of my favorite styles of storytelling, which is to leave lots of things for fans to interpret, rather than just explicitly stating them. Things like, who was Tom Bombadil in Lord of the Rings, or the entire plot in Dark Souls. Final Fantasy VIII doesn't do it to the same scale as those two works of art do, but it does have its own fair share of depth to it. Squall is extremely antisocial, and there's a reason for it. But how do you show this instead of telling? Well, you would have to have cutscenes showing him that he's rather antisocial. There are several flashbacks to Squall's childhood inferring why he is the way he is, but it's mostly left to the player to interpret, and it doesn't just throw them all early on so that the player understands where Squall's coming from. Some people find Squall to be insufferable because of his personality, or they get angry that the sufficient explanation comes too late in the game, but I feel like it's more natural this way. Maybe being a more introverted person myself, it was easier for me to accept. I imagine a more extroverted individual getting more upset with Squall, but that's just a personality difference, not an issue with the game's writing itself. Not only that, but one of the reasons Squall is the way he is because he's meant to be a foil for the more extroverted Rinoa, his love interest. Also his father as well, but we'll get to him in a bit. Squall grows over the course of the game. He doesn't just stay the same way the whole time. He begins to open up as he experiences new things, which is rather realistic, I think. I'd say he acts his age pretty well actually, if you take into consideration that he is introverted, and has reasons for being so. I'm getting ahead of myself, but just know that there is growth for Squall over the course of the game. There's reasons for him to be quiet and brooding. He opens up slowly as the game progresses, and becomes more emotional as the plot develops. We'll come back to this later during the analysis portion of the video. As Squall leaves class for the day, Keista stops him to ask if he's finished his field exam yet, and to check his computer terminal at his desk if he needs to brush up on the game. This computer terminal actually has several bits of lore to the game, such as giving Squall access to his first two GFs, which of course means girlfriends. One of them is hot, the other is a furry. Square showed their hobbies here by giving the furry the best abilities in the game as well. I'm not here to judge though. Also, there's some backstory information in this computer terminal, like how the Skull Festival committee never finished its goal since no one would ever help, and about how people are studying something called paramagic in order to give people the ability to use magic in real life. This works into the junctioning system as Balam Garden is studying how to use GFs in order to channel magic themselves. Also, they definitely don't cause amnesia, and if I see anybody posting this misinformation online, I'll ban you from Twitter and put you on a watch list. You can get your GFs later if you want to, but it's nice getting them now with the useless tutorials and background lore. When you leave the class, you'll run into a transfer student from another garden who asks Squall to show her around, being new to Balam Garden and all. And this works as an introduction to Garden for the player as well, as Squall will take her to the directory and explains what every section of the garden is used for. You can also use this directory to fast travel to different places in Garden. With that out of the way, Squall is trying to graduate from the academy to become an official member of SEED, so he goes with Keistis to a fire cavern. The game then gives a basic tutorial on how GFs work, but they're too wordy and not hands-on enough. I recommend skipping all the tutorials in this game. Look up anything online if you're confused by it. I give a basic tutorial towards the end of this video, which I'll leave timestamps for in the description if you're interested. The Fire Cavern has the dungeon BGM in this game, and again, it's one of my favorite dungeon BGMs in the Final Fantasy series. It's hard to explain what it evoked in my child brain way back when, but maybe the best words for it would be ominous or mysterious or foreboding, which works really well for a dungeon. Again, voice acting wasn't super common back then, so most games had amazing soundtracks in order to convey emotions. Anyway, this dungeon has one of the first hidden mechanics in the game. Depending on how well you do in the next several story events, you will get a different rank of SEED. That's right, The game judges your performance and gives you a rank and seed based off of how well or terrible you did. In this game, you don't get money from killing monsters like in a normal JRPG. I mean, why would monsters have money on them to begin with? Instead, after becoming a seed, you are paid a salary every several thousand steps or so. I don't know the actual number, so don't take that at face value. Of course, if you do poorly, you get a lower rank and get paid less, and vice versa if you do well. That said, just so you don't screw yourself, there are a bunch of tests you can take that raise your seed rank up, which you can find in the main menu. You can take them at any time once you become seed. Also, even after you get a rank in the story, depending on how you do things in-game, you will get promotions or demotions. Different decisions and other story events can affect your ranking. So do things such as the number of enemies you killed in battle. Here's a chart describing the things that affect your seed rank throughout the story. I think it's pretty cool that you get a seller in this game, since you are supposed to be an actual working member of society now. Not that money does much in this game. And with that explained, let's get back to the fire cavern. You are required to say how long it will take you to complete this dungeon, which you may think will affect your overall ranking. But actually, the time you choose doesn't technically matter. Instead, you are rated by how much time you have left when you finish the boss in the dungeon. The game says if you have less time, you are a good judge of how much time it takes you to complete your task and gives you a higher rank. It's kinda weird, but I get it. After this boss, Squall and Kisis can go back to Balam Garden and get prepped for the seed graduation mission. Also, go back to Squall's PC terminal in the classroom and check the festival committee every now and then. You'll be able to read some diary entries from one of your future party members, the transfer student from earlier. Here, you can find that Balam Garden is the only garden that uses GFs, and she's a bit worried for her memory. She's probably on the list for that. After all that, Squall has to get dressed properly for his seed graduation mission. Here, you are introduced to the headmaster, Robin Williams, who gives you the details for this mission. For some reason, this school is sending a bunch of 17-year-olds to liberate a city which has been invaded by a neighboring kingdom. Maybe we just live in a time of peace and abundance, but that seems like a little much for someone who's not even legally an adult to handle. I mean, when I was 17, I knew how to use a gun, but leading a mercenary brigade to fight an actual army? Hell no. Granted, it would be a smoother experience than the US pulling out of Afghanistan. For this mission, we are joined by Squall's rival, Cypher, and a new party member, Zell Dinscht, or however you pronounce that, the Kung Fu Master. His limit break revolves around you putting in button combinations to do crazy karate moves like a fighting game. It's pretty good, especially late game. You unlock new combos by finding karate magazines throughout the world. Spoiler alert, Cypher doesn't stay in your party, but Zell does. In fact, if you want, you can kill Zell and Squall and have Cypher level up your GFs at this point so they can learn new abilities without raising your real party members' levels. Not sure if I'd recommend it though, since it is grinding intensive. Maybe use it to learn card and or card mod with Quetzalcoatl. There's a better place to do this back in Balam, but it requires someone actually important gaining experience, at least until you learn the card ability. Anyway, during this mission, you basically learn Cypher's a hothead who hates following orders and he charges into battle, abandoning you and Zell who try to run after him since he is supposed to be your squad leader. Here, you meet another permanent party member, Selphie Tilmet. Her limit break allows her to use any spell in the game, but it's on this ridiculous roulette system, so I hope your gacha luck is good if you actually want to rely on this. She does have 2 spells that can one-shot any enemy in the game, but I personally have never seen either of them due to how extremely low odds they are. There's also substantially easier ways to become overpowered in this game, but if you're interested, you can try her out. Okay, a correction to this. I ended up seeing one of these spells as I was playing the game to get the footage for this part. I wrote most of the synopsis before getting any of the footage as I needed to know what footage I needed to get, and so one of these spells is playing in the background here. Basically, her limit break is Magic Gacha, because you can't have a Japanese game without gacha in it. The game never really explains why she can use magic when it's already established that humans don't natively use magic unless it's a sorceress. But later in the game, Selphie mentioned she once junctioned a GF to herself when she was very young. We'll get back to this later, but that might be why she has access to magic she shouldn't have, including 2 broken as fuck spells. After her introduction, you fight some bosses who are repairing a radio tower, get chased by a robot spider, and see how badass your teacher is. You then learn that the invading army was just after the radio tower, for some reason, and then they agree to pull out of the city as long as the radio tower remained operational. Like, dude, what the fuck? I know nations go to war for, really dumb reasons in real life, but the fucking radio? Did they just fucking hate their music or something? Was it country? Dubstep? Hold on, let me go to the menu and read up some background information on this. Ew. Okay, so there's some sort of noise interfering with the radio signals in this world. It began about 17 years ago, so most communications happen through HD cables. This seems like information that should be, explicitly stated in mandatory dialogue, but in the end, I guess it doesn't impact the story too much. Anyway, the squad comes back to Balam Garden to become seeds. Cypher does not, however, as he ignored orders. Sucks to be him. Before this, I do recommend going back to the town of Balam first and entering the house on the right when you first enter the main street. Talk to some NPCs for some backstory in the game about some dude named Hein. He doesn't specifically come into the storyline, but he does have something to do with the sorceresses in this world. The sorceresses being female humans who can use magic naturally due to their inheriting its blood. Again, it's not necessary for the plot, but it helps with the world building. I recommend going around every area at least once and talking to all the NPCs whenever you get to a new area. Now that Squall, Zell, and Selfie, and some random dude you may see around Garden every now and then, have become seeds, there's a fancy dance you all have to go to. This is the event that also brings Squall together with his love interest for the first time. By the way, this entire interaction prior to the dance is how every conversation between an introvert and an extrovert goes. Like, this game is probably the most realistic fantasy game I've ever played simply due to this one scene, including the part where Squall talks to Keystis right after. After this event, Squall, Zell, and Selfie are sent out on their first mission to help liberate a town under occupation by the same military that occupied the city in their seed exam. Headmaster Sid gives you a magic lantern. He then tells you to save before using it, as it's a bit dangerous due to containing the fucking devil himself in it, and then you're on your way. Also, before leaving, Selfie has a new diary entry in the PC terminal in the second floor classroom. I think a lot of people miss this when playing the game. I recommend coming back often if you're interested in it. A lot of FF8 has things you only know by walking around and talking to NPCs. I don't like comparing it to a Falcom game, but there's definitely a lot of information you can find just by talking to random people. Anyway, the three head to the train station and get on surely Garden has already paid for our tickets in advance, right? Please check again. Please? What the fuck? The military school doesn't even pay for its employees' travel expenses that take them across the whole fucking world? What if I would have spent all my money on items earlier? I mean, at least we get a salary, but still. So yeah, the organization you work for has shitty business practices and makes its employees pay for their own expenses. Squall begrudgingly pays for his train ticket and enters the locomotive. Selfie turns out to have a train fetish, and Zell reveals that he has a couple of his own. Squall, did you know that in terms of human Pokemon compatibility? Wait, what's that noise? And then you end up in the first dream sequence of the game. So, periodically throughout the game, you'll be pulled out of the main story to play the roles of Laguna, Kiros, and Ward. They are a trio of soldiers from the army you've been fighting during your seed missions in the Squall sections of the game. They're a rather charming group of bros that seem to just go around having a bunch of fun with each other rather than actually doing any fighting. Mostly comedic events follow the group, but they also have one of the coolest battle themes in the series, the man with the machine gun. During this event, you see these three get lost and so just fuck off from their jobs to go to a piano bar to drink themselves shitless. Except Laguna has a crush on the pianist Julia. He simply enjoys his time watching her, drinking with his mates and smiling at her, not realizing she too had her eyes on him. Laguna is bullied into going to say hi to her mid-performance, at which point he walks up to her just to break his leg. Julia, upon seeing a man spilling the spaghetti in front of her, feels bad for him and invites him up to her room for sympathy sex. There, Laguna gets drunk and rolls a nat 20 with his charisma roll and somehow convinces Julia to fall in love with him. Truthfully, they have a pretty sweet talk about the dreams they share, Julia also mentioning how she loved how Laguna always shyly placed his eyes on her, which freaks him out, but also makes him happy, thinking that he must be dreaming, causing Julia to pinch him softly but sure in order to prove that he isn't dreaming. They talk about how Julia wants to sing, not just play the piano, and Laguna wants to become a journalist, but has to go fight in an ongoing war. You can actually find his articles throughout the game called the Timber Maniacs. Actually, one of these is available before getting on the train as Squall, and this scene plays out a little bit differently if you've read it beforehand. Unfortunately, this was the last night they could spend with each other, as Laguna receives orders that send him far away. He never returns, and eventually Julia writes lyrics to the piano piece she was playing and it becomes a famous hit song. This song is later revealed to be Eyes on Me, but we'll get back to that later. Also, prior to coming up to Julia's room, you can talk to these soldiers in the bar, and one of them is jealous of Laguna's lady-killing skills and decides to abuse his use of authority to send him super far away. This officer is implied to be a certain named character later, but we'll get back to that when he actually shows up. Just keep it in mind because, again, the game never explicitly states who this guy is. It's just something you figure out when you play the game several times. I think it's pretty cool, but I'm getting sidetracked. After this series of events, Squall, Zell, and Selphie wake up on the train, realizing they all share the same dream. Not understanding what just happened to them, they hold off on talking about it. They arrive at their destination of Timber and meet a group of rebels fighting against the forces of Galbadia, that being the name of the nation that's been invading everybody. This rebel group is one of the many opposing Galbadia. Here, you are reintroduced to the girl Squall danced with at the party and finally get her name. Rinoa Heartily. Her limit breaks are tied to her dog and range from being a complete waste of a turn to one of the most broken skills in the game. You unlock more by fighting some Zell's pet fetish magazines throughout the game. She's a super pampered individual and everybody simps for her. I have no right to judge though, since I too fell down the simping well ever since I got into VTubers. That said, simps don't make for very good rebels, and you end up with a bunch of guys that have no idea what the hell they're actually doing. One in particular handles pressure worse than a mine. While Squall can't take any of them seriously, he has a contract to them, and as such, helps them try to kidnap the president of Galbadia. They have this ridiculous plan to jump onto the president's train car while it's moving and disconnected, use their own train to hook up to it, and then separate from the rest of the Galbadian train. Somehow, the rebels were able to get the exact design specs for the president's car and switch out a fake one for the real one. This entire section really just seems like a 4-year-old trying to direct a movie, but since they have orders, Squall decides to follow them. After doing such, they realize it was a trap, and Galbadia somehow replaced the president with a zombie body double. You would have thought our intel would have known about this beforehand, considering they knew the exact specifications of the train car to begin with, but whatever. This turns to a boss fight, which starts with you attacking the president. He's not hard at all, but then he transforms into a hideous abomination that used to give me trouble when I was a child, until I realized a single fucking feather kills him in one hit on account of him being undead. Once back at Timber, Squall finally calls these rebels stupid, which really upsets Rinoa, who decides to cancel the contract, which is never brought up again, and Squall continues to act as if he's still contracted with them. Actually, I should go ahead and mention that there are several times Squall gets dialogue options that you, the player, get to choose. Choices that have him avoid conversation are usually not too good, but they are a bit more in character for him, at least earlier on. As the game goes on, I highly recommend you choose the more verbose dialogue options, as Squall's romance development is locked behind choosing those specific ones. Otherwise, the romance would feel rather forced. I like that they gave the player freedom of choice in these dialogues, but it really shouldn't prevent the development of the romance in the story from happening. Because if you just choose the ellipses options, or the whatever options, Squall falling for Rinoa comes completely out of fucking nowhere. Like, this bitch tried to just get us killed in an insane train robbery, let's get married. Anyway, this next scene happens in front of a large screen, which has some weird noise going on. The noise actually has some messages that foreshadow a greater threat later in the game, but you'd have no way of knowing that without having played the game first already. Also, trying to read the screen without being able to pause it makes the message completely legible. I recommend googling it after disc 3 of the game if you're interested. Anyway, suddenly the real president of Galbadia shows up on TV with an announcer, who freaks out. Again, the radios and TVs of this world have been unused for 17 years. However, Cypher storms in during the president's speech and holds him hostage. Squall, Selphie, and Zell rush to the building the speech is being held at, and Zell yells at Cypher for doing something so stupid, accidentally dropping Garden's name. This incriminates the Garden, and the president threatens to have Garden blocked from Twitter if anything happened to him. This puts Cypher in a bind now as the head of Garden's social media department, and since he isn't really Seed, he is afraid he will be disavowed by the Garden if necessary. He pulls the president off stage as he searches for a way out of this new predicament. At this point, the current sorcerer shows him up and offers him a way out. Keistis was also here as she was trying to stop Cypher, but she arrives right after he kidnaps the president and was unable to restrain him. She groups up with Squall and company, who then meet up with Rinoa. They run away and take shelter as they discuss their current situation. Rinoa reveals that she and Cypher had a thing at one point before and hopes nothing bad happens to him, which Squall is rather callous towards. At this point, the party decides to go to the nearest garden, called Galbadia Garden. This will be the second of the 3 gardens in this world, the last one being on a continent without any known cities, so I'm not really sure how it has a population of students, but whatever. From this moment, Keistis is a permanent party member, so I should explain how her limit break works. She is this game's blue mage. For those of you who haven't played many Final Fantasy games, a blue mage is a mage that uses enemy skills. For Keistis, she learns new enemy skills from items you can get in the game either via item drops after battles or using cards and transforming them into the appropriate item. These skills can range from single-hit attacks, multi-hit attacks, opening a black hole that kills any non-boss monster, or even buffs and heals. Some of these are extremely useful for certain boss fights. Depending on your party level, you may be able to get some pretty good ones early on while traveling to Galbadia Garden. Enemies drop different items at different levels, but the Adamantoise on the beaches near Dalit and Galbadia Garden can drop an item that gives white wind. This is an ability which heals the entire party for thousands of HP. Once you get close to Galbadia Garden, you'll have to pass through some woods. Here is the game's second dream sequence. Once again, you will play as Laguna, Kiros, and Ward, fighting some weird cyber soldiers with terrible posture, like some sort of cybernetic Smeagol. After running around the place, the trio find a way to escape from their assailants, but it's at the bottom of a cliff. Instead of climbing down like a normal person, Laguna tries to murder his friends by tossing them off the cliff. He then tries to descend normally, but since Karma's a bitch, he trips and falls all the way down as well, which would have broken his spine, but as we saw in his cutscene with Julia, he doesn't have one, so that worked out in his favor. Squall and the others wake up and decide to continue on because, again, there's no use trying to figure out anything about the dream since they don't even know where to begin. They arrive at Galbadia Garden and await orders from their home garden. Eventually, they meet up and hear that Cypher had his sentence carried out. It all sounds very sad, but then Cypher's two best friends call him with some news and then ask where he is. When told he's been executed, his own best friends just laugh at the news. This would make you think Cypher really must have been an asshole if his own friends were glad that he's dead. But then they follow it up with a, nah, Cypher doesn't have the patience for a trial or execution, he's fine, which I guess would be the best defense for someone who attempted the murder of a national leader. I know whenever I get in trouble, I just walk out of the court. Haven't caught me yet. Afterwards, Squall and company get an announcement to group up at the front gate of the garden, at which you will be introduced to your last party member, Irvine Kineas. His limit break uses a consumable item type called ammo, which has different types of ammo that have different abilities. For your party, I'd say in terms of best to worst limit breaks, it would be Squall, Zell, Irvine, Keistis, Selfie, and then probably Rhinoa. Now I know that most of you who have played this game will argue about the last one, but her only good limit break is locked until the end of Disc 3, so for now she has the worst limit break until then. When she gets Angel Wing, then she becomes one of the best, but I feel like the men are less random so they deal consistent amounts of damage. Now, back to the game. Squall and company are informed that they will work with Irvine to assassinate the sorceress, who is using her magical abilities to manipulate everyone into giving her unlimited power in order to take over the country. Everyone groups up together and goes to the capital of Galbadia, called Daling City. Fast forward to another train ticket away, and you arrive at Daling City. When I was younger, I actually got super lost at this part as the game told me to go to Daling City and mentions the train, but I figured, why not walk? I don't want to spend money. So I tried walking there, but then they wouldn't let me in. I forgot how to progress in the story and get running around aimlessly for hours until I finally arrived back at the train station. It's the only independent train station in the game that actually has its own damn map. Like, I didn't realize there would be an actual required cutscene there. But apparently there is, and you do have to see it. So, after begrudgingly paying for another train ticket, we arrive at Daling City. Squall meets up with one of Galbadia military's generals and finds out he is Renoa's father. General Caraway informs everyone of their mission and tries to put Renoa under house arrest since she's the only person in the group who still acts like a child. Which, in her defense, everyone except for Keistis is legally a child, so I suppose that makes sense for her to be the most realistic person in the group. Unfortunately, as most teens do, she rebels against her father and escapes house arrest anyway, but Keistis, Selfie, and Zell get trapped instead. Keistis had gotten into a fight with Rhinoa and wanted to apologize to her. For some reason, Zell and Selfie just had to come with Keistis, and as such, all three abandoned their posts and are now stuck, so they have to go through the sewer system of the city to get back to their posts, while Squall and Irvine get ready to act on the sorceress. The sorceress then gives an inspiring speech about how everything will be absolutely amazing from now on. This results in Rhinoa getting mauled by some weird stone statues that the sorceress transformed into actual living monsters. I mean, if she has Jesus powers, I don't know why she doesn't just kill Rhinoa immediately, as I'm sure it would take all of 3 seconds, but I guess she has better things to do. Squall and Irvine jump in to rescue Rhinoa, who has been getting mauled by these same statues for like 10 minutes now. Still not sure how she's not dead. Doesn't matter, I suppose. At this point, Rhinoa grasps onto Squall, thanking him for saving her, which marks the point where she starts to see him in a positive light. Irvine and Squall take up positions to assassinate the sorceress, but Irvine cannot take the shot. He says he always chokes when push comes to shove, and Squall can't believe a professional would behave in such a way. He has to convince Irvine why he needs to take the shot even if he misses. I really like some of these events with Squall because he's super introverted but is forced to speak to a bunch of people he's really uncomfortable with and ends up thinking up a whole bunch of insults in his head while doing it. I'm sure most of the introverts in the audience can probably relate to at least the first half of that. Squall's just like, for the love of, why am I always in these weird situations? This is why I hate going outside. People suck. I wish I was back home playing Triple Triad. Also, I should mention, the reason Irvine gives for not being able to pull the trigger is completely bullshit, but the game never actually explicitly states this. We'll get to it later, but I really like how they did this actually. It makes so much sense why you can't pull the trigger, but you just have to wait until the second disc before you get enough information to determine why. Again, the game never explicitly states why, but once you get to a certain event, you'll be like, oh, so that's why he couldn't pull the trigger. We'll get back to that when it comes up. But for now, Irvine eventually takes the shot, but as they took too long, the sorceress realized it was all a trap and erects a barrier blocking the bullet. Squall assures him that he did nothing wrong and then goes and fights the sorceress one-on-one. And then comes across Cypher, who has apparently become the sorceress's lapdog. Apparently, this is some sort of dream Cypher has had for a long time. Also, I have no idea why Cypher didn't really say anything about the sorceress's identity here. Like, we don't know anything yet, but realistically speaking, Cypher should mention something at least. Even if it would just confuse Squall and the player, I think they should have foreshadowed a certain plot element later, but unfortunately, Cypher does not do that. So you two duel, unfortunately not in Triple Triad this time, and once you win, you fight the sorceress named Adia. Once the fight begins, Irvine and Ranoa immediately join in and help defeat her. And then you lose immediately in the cutscene after the fight. I absolutely despise it when games have you defeat a boss. You do it extremely easily and then you lose in the following cutscene. Thankfully, this is the only time this happens in the game, so at least it's not as bad as, say, Trails of Cold Steel 2 or 4, in which every major boss fight ends with bosses going, aha, this wasn't even my final form. That's a topic for another time though. Sorceress Adia impales Squall through the shoulder with icicles and he falls to his death. The end. Game over. Or at least that's what one of my friends thought. He hasn't played the game past this point, and he told me that he really enjoyed the game, but once he finished this boss fight, he felt like he just played an entire full game and just kind of stopped playing. That's rather unfortunate as it's only a quarter through the game, and I feel like the best parts come in Disc 2 and 3, which is where we're going next. Disc 2. The game puts you back in the role of Laguna, who apparently washed up on a shore to a small rural village called Windhill after the last Dream Sequences event. Most of the residents are really old people, as the younger adults were all shipped off to war and the children were all kidnapped by a lolicon, except for one. See, Laguna actually did break most of his bones after the fall he went through, and a young woman named Rain nursed him back to health. In return, he decided to help out the town as monsters have been moving in due to the lack of a town guard. Here we see that Laguna is very close to a woman named Rain and a young child named Alone. Alone is a character who has shown up several times as an adult to school a few times, but I neglected to mention her as her appearances earlier really served no purpose other than to confuse the player as to who this random person was. Anyway, Laguna meets up with Kiros, who has been searching for him ever since the events of the last dream sequence, and they catch up. They find out that Ward lost his ability to speak thanks to the prior events and now works as a janitor at a certain military jail. Laguna also asks about Julia, and Kiros and Rain inform him that she's now married. After her first love never returned from the war, she married to a General Caraway, but released a hit song that was something of a tribute to her first love. That's right, Rinoa is Julia's daughter. I mentioned the officer in Julia's bar that threatens to send Laguna to a faraway place, so I'll bring that up again here. They never confirmed this, but I feel like they are trying to imply that this officer is a young General Caraway, probably before he was a general, but still an officer. Keep all this in mind for the analysis portion of the game. For now, Kiros and Laguna go around town to patrol for monsters. Upon returning to the bar, they overhear Rain and Alone talking, with Alone suggesting that Rain should marry Laguna. Rain mentions she feels the same about Laguna as Alone does, but knows Laguna really wants to travel the world instead of settling down. While it does upset her a bit, she doesn't want to be the reason he can't do what he wants to do in his life. Laguna's leg becomes a noodle again and then goes to bed. And this ends the dream sequence. Rinoa, Selphie, Keistis, and Zell awaken in a jail cell. Apparently, assassinations are illegal in whatever world this is. Who would have thought? Squall and Irvine are missing, and this is apparently because Squall is going to be tortured for information, while Irvine, despite being the sharpshooter who tried killing the sorceress and participating in the actual fight with her, he was found innocent and, as such, was not arrested. Rinoa gets released as well because her father is a general, I guess. I'm not sure what kind of political power allows a general to get his daughter out of prison after trying to execute your national leader, but whatever. Like, if anything, I'd assume he'd be in prison with her too, but no, she gets out of jail instead. We find out that this prison is the prison that Ward worked at from the dream sequence, and Zell was participating in the dream sequence as Ward, so, using his knowledge, he stages a breakout. He tells a prison guard that somehow a venomous snake has snuck into a maximum security prison and bit the girls. You know, in this completely metallic skyscraper prison. The prison guard must have been one of those special hires, as he falls for this scheme and comes running in, only to get punched by Zell. Zell then runs out and retrieves everyone's weapons, then comes back to arm Selfie and Gistis. Selfie and Gistis then run around looking for Squall on the way out, stopping to play cards with a random prisoner after manipulating the RNG of the world in order to get several Rosetta Stones. Also, for some reason, everyone's cells are unlocked, but no one aside from Zell and company are interested in breaking out. Meanwhile, Squall gets tortured by Cypher, who wants to know what Seed is, insecure about the potency of his own. Squall is understandably confused, but being unable to hurt himself in confusion, Cypher electrocutes him instead. Personally, I think Cypher just gets off to abusing his power. Either that or he's into some heavy BDSM. Either way, I ship it. The team rescues Squall with the help of some monkey men. Then, Zell gets them on some weird arm elevator and lowers them to the bottom of the tower. No idea how he planned on getting down after them, as the prison is still trying to either find them or execute them, and he'll be all by himself. Squall and the others get to the exit, but a bunch of sand bursts through the doors and blocks them. Then they hear gunfire and Zell running around like a chicken with his head cut off, which is probably a reference to him being a chicken wuss. Squall is able to rescue Zell, but then the group is pinned down again. They are rescued by Irvine and Rinoa, who are coming to rescue them after Rinoa beat the shit out of Irvine for abandoning everybody. She also probably wanted to vent some stress after finding out her boyfriend isn't a MILF and got NTR'd because of it. At this point, they escape from the prison, which is apparently capable of drilling into the desert to prevent anybody from escaping, but for whatever reason, the prison was actually raised right now. Anyway, now that they've escaped from prison, they pull over as Squall and Irvine inform the group that Galbadia is going to destroy both Balam Garden and Trabia Garden, which is where Selfie is from, via warheads delivered by Amazon's one-day shipping scheme. Galbadia's garden gets a pass because the Galbadian military decided to commandeer its premises and use it as their own base. Selfie groups up with 2 other members to go to stop the missiles, and Squall leads a team back to Balam Garden to evacuate everyone. Something I should mention here is, if you send Rinoa with Selfie, or if you bring her with Squall, it changes several cutscenes later in this disc. But for now, you will take control of Selfie, but before getting to the base, they will see some missiles get fired. The first salvo was dedicated to Trabia Garden to wipe out the only known remnants of civilization on that continent. Selfie decides that they can still try to save Balam Garden and sneak into the base to screw around with it and blow it up. For some reason, Galbadia had the error ratio of the missiles turned all the way down, meaning all the missiles would most likely hit the exact same spot and minimize damage. Selfie, presumably either ignorant of this fact or just out of malice of how poorly managed Balam Garden is, turns the error ratio all the way up, which will, in turn, increase the missile spread, causing even more damage to the garden. Yeah, I don't think Square knew what they were talking about with this. Like, I'm a controls engineer myself, so I kind of understand all this stuff. Although I don't really work with weapon systems, but in my opinion, if you're trying to destroy a location with missiles, you'd probably want them to have a decent spread rather than landing all in the same spot. I think most people would miss this, and it's really not that big of a deal in the long run, as we know what Square was trying to do. So, like most problems in my life, let's just ignore it and move on. Selfie and company weren't able to stop the missile salvo aimed at Balam Garden, but the game acts as if they were able to mess with its guidance system, so it should decrease its accuracy. A later FMV sequence shows that this didn't work at all, but we'll get to that in a bit. Selfie attacks the base's commander and then hits the self-destruct switch that comes standard with all military bases worldwide. So again, the game is being very realistic here. Selfie's party fights a tank and the base blows up, with the game acting as if Selfie's party is dead for a bit. But not even a child would fall for that. I know this because even when I was a child, I didn't fall for it. Squall's group gets back to Balam Garden, only to find a civil war amongst its ranks. Apparently, Headmaster Sid had a business partner who people are calling the Garden Master. Here, Squall can choose to side with either Sid or the Garden Master. Siding with the Garden Master can prevent some fights from showing up at a cost of your seed rank, since the Garden Master loses regardless of what you do. You aren't meant to know who the Garden Master is at this point, but you do need to see Sid immediately to warn him of the missiles. You go through each of the wards of the garden looking for him, and if you sided with Sid, fight some monsters attacking students. Even if you do side with Sid, there are a few instances where the game lets you choose to get involved or not, which, upon choosing not to help, the people actually fucking die. Rescuing people allows you to talk to them and get some items, like an elixir, and none of them are too hard, so I recommend rescuing everyone. Just watch out for the T-Rex as it hits hard and has a lot of HP. Its weakness is sleep, by the way. And limit breaks, but that's a weakness to every enemy in the game. Once Squall finally finds someone who knows where Sid is, they find out that Sid is actually in his office the whole time. Like, no one fucking bothered to check? They pass it off as if they made it seem like Sid was everywhere other than his office by giving their opponents bad information, but no one bothered to check just to make sure. No one tried to block it off in case he tried to come back. Anyway, Sid tells Squall that Garden used to be a shelter, and there should be a way to protect it against some missile barrage. So, Squall goes into an elevator shaft and finds some controls to turn Garden into a hovering mobile base. After struggling to activate the control system for way too long, Squall finally gets the system activated. I'm super confused as to how this place would be realistically accessed because the game makes it sound like the only way through there is the elevator shaft. But once Garden becomes mobile, the control system raises up to the top of Garden with Squall and company on its control platform. Garden moves out of the way of the missiles, which hit exactly where it had been, meaning that Selphie's entire operation resulted in a complete failure, even with messing with the targeting systems. Garden heads toward the town of Balam, and Sid, behaving just like a leader, freaks out and tells Squall to do something about it before they crash into the town. Just like how I play fighting games, Squall starts mashing buttons and somehow turns the Garden, so it ends up setting down in the sea, only to realize that nobody actually knows how to pilot the damn thing. At this point, everybody just fucks off, and if you brought Rinoa with Squall's group, she has Squall show her around Garden. If you didn't bring her, then you miss out on this sequence and it just ends with the next event. Their date gets interrupted as they must go speak with the Garden Master, Norg, who proceeds to inform Squall that Sid is Adia's husband, and he plans on giving all the seeds' heads to the sorceress and hopes she'll not kill him. As such, Squall kills him. Afterwards, another interrupted date occurs as Sid calls for Squall to help with a group of white seeds who suddenly showed up looking for a girl called Alone. Squall tracks down Alone at the library and finds out she's the one causing the dream sequences. There's scenes from the past where Alone is trying to change history, and it'd probably help if she actually mentioned what the fuck she was trying to change so Squall could actually do something to help her. Instead, she's just like, "Help me, Squall, you're my only hope," and then GTFOs. After this sequence, Squall has a dream where he's crying for his big sis, and Garden crashes into a city in the water. This new location is called Fisherman's Horizon, a city built at the halfway point of the international transoceanic railway system that exists in this world. Squall goes on shore to apologize to the mayor, who just asked them to leave as soon as possible as they didn't want to have any trouble. Fisherman's Horizon is a city of super engineers, as these people somehow built a city here to begin with, and so they help get Garden unstuck and teach someone how to pilot it. Surprise! Trouble shows up. Galbadia invades Fisherman's Horizon looking for Alone. Squall and company chase them out and reunite with Selphie and company, who were apparently piloting a giant robot trying to kill Squall. Like, I don't understand this. There's a diary entry after this event back at the computer terminal in the classroom back in Garden mentioning this. Selphie is like, "Yeah, we totally weren't trying to kill you, Squall, please believe me." But do you honestly believe this wench? The only explanation to this is that Selphie and her group got a bit Benedict Arnoldy and wanted to murder Squall. Once that plan failed, they acted like they were happy to see him. Squall, missing the social cues that his friends were trying to murder him, is happy to see them as well. Well, as happy as an antisocial loner autist can be. They decide to throw a party for Squall as well, since he's been promoted to the new headmaster of this military academy at the age of 17. Yeah, the antisocial loner who has no idea how to talk to people is now responsible for the entire well-being of everyone at Garden. I should reiterate, Squall is 17. Squall, understandably, does not want this position. He, understandably, freaks out. He, understandably, doesn't want to deal with this shit. Luckily, there's other members of SEED who can act as his advisors, and by that, I mean they're the ones who actually take care of everything, as Squall continues going around acting like a normal member of SEED. Anyway, at this party, the group tries to play matchmaker to get Squall and Rinoa together. Depending on what instruments you tell everyone to play, you play different songs. And there's actually like 3 or 4 different versions of the event that plays afterwards, depending on which instruments you choose. I always forget which instruments need to be used, so Rinoa always tells me I fucked up with my choices, but it seems to be mostly fine. Actually, I also uploaded a video specifically of this event showing the different variations. The beginning of this event starts the same, with Rinoa teasing Squall and Squall trying to bitch slap her, or at least that's apparently what people were complaining about when this game first came out. I always thought this scene was just meant to be a playful bickering, because if Squall really wanted to hit Rinoa, he would have. Even when blind, his hit rate is perfect. Anyway, they have a wholesome moment if you pick a specific composition, but otherwise they get into an argument, probably because Rinoa literally pushes Squall off a cliff and breaks his legs. That's usually how the conversation goes for me anyway, cause I suck at musical composition. Rinoa runs away, and Squall passes out for the pain of having his ankle shattered. Back at Garden, the party decides to go to the town of Balam to make sure it's still safe. Galbadia is looking for a loan for some reason, and since Balam Garden used to be near the town of Balam, they worry the town might be targeted. Here, you see that Galbadia Garden is also mobile, similar to Balam Garden, and that the town of Balam has been occupied by the Galbadian military. The party tries to get in, but is refused until they mention that they have information on a loan. This results in the party going around town looking for the captain in order to get to the commander of the occupying forces. Turns out these two are actually Cypher's best friends, Fujin and Raijin, who have popped up a few times so far, but aren't really too important to the plot. Except Fujin does have a GF on her, so you make sure you rip that out of her with a draw command. Anyway, they seem to only be on Cypher's side, not Galbadia's, and they just want to see their best friend's dream come true. Squall tells them that they are the only ones who convinced him to stop this madness, so they decide to give it a go. Spoiler alert, they fail. After liberating Balam, Selphie is worried about Trabia Garden, as that was her home. She requests if Squall will take her there, which he agrees to. Before that, I should mention that the game does have some extra side quests that I highly recommend doing. You can do all of the Chocobo Force minigames, which suck ass but grant you access to something amazing in the final disc of the game. You can do the King of Cards side quest, which is also required for the same amazing stuff in the final disc of the game. You can also go get the GFs Tonberry and Odin, though Odin is an RNG GF that only shows up and kills everything on the field at random intervals. If you don't want to level up, avoid getting him until at least much later into the game. Tonberry, on the other hand, requires you killing 20 Tonberries, and then you fight a Tonberry King right after you finish off the 20th one. Upon defeating it, you get the Tonberry GF. Nothing tells you to kill the 20 Tonberries in the game, but I like it when games don't handhold you and tell you to do specific things every step of the way. Sometimes it might be annoying, but that's what the internet's for. Let me explore without handholding, please. There is also a Shumi Tribe questline which deals with Norg's race and gives some more backstory for Laguna. There's also a Timber Maniacs volume here, which if you read it now, changes a dream sequence later in the game, which again, I think is amazing that the game changes based off of what you have done in optional content. Just exploring this world feels very rewarding because you keep coming across new content, dungeons, and bosses to fight without any prompting you to do so. I really wish modern games would add stuff like this, but nowadays every game just feels like a narrow hallway without any optional content. Or removing optional content in the case of remakes, like the Pokemon games. Anyway, after all these side quests, Squall has to go to Trabia Garden to continue the story. It is here you see that the missile has killed several people. Everyone resolves to fight the sorceress except Rinoa, who wants to find another way. She's become terrified of being left behind by everyone, who all seems to be marching to the same beat except for her, causing her to lose faith that she has any reason to be here at all. To this, Irvine mentions how he can kind of relate about feeling left out at times. He then talks about how he grew up in an orphanage when he was a kid. He grew up with several other kids who were orphaned during the Sorceress War, which took place during Laguna's time. These other kids turned out to be every other member of your party except for Rinoa. Also, Alone and Cypher were there too. Everyone except for Irvine forgot. Yeah, it wouldn't be a JRPG if the main character didn't have fucking amnesia, now would it? You weren't expecting anything different, right? I mean, the game mentions amnesia like twice up to this point in completely optional dialogue you can find. See, I mentioned amnesia a couple times earlier specifically because I wanted you guys to realize that there are parts of the game that do try to foreshadow this event. The foreshadow is just a bit weak in my opinion, but at the end of the day, it's not super important in the long run of the story. The party knew each other as kids. Also, the sorceress they're meant to kill was their matron at the orphanage. Okay, yeah, that part's a little bit important, but you know, whatever. It's never explicitly stated in the game, but that's implied to be the reason why Irvine couldn't actually shoot Adia at the end of Disc 1. It was his mother figure. I really like that it doesn't explicitly state this about Irvine. The man just couldn't gun down his own mother. Which is why the party decides to go and murder Adia immediately after this event finishes. A bit quick to the trigger in my opinion, but at the same time, she is going around conquering towns and murdering people, so I kind of get why. Though I think it could have been written a little bit better. Like, I think it should have been drawn a little bit longer that they had to fight their mother figure, but I digress. It's not the most egregious writing I've ever read, and I don't think it's that bad. I'll talk about how it could have been improved later in the analysis portion of the video, so I'll leave it at that for now. Squall and company fly towards the orphanage of their youth, which is on a completely separate continent from both nations that were at war 17 years ago without any semblance of civilization on it except for this orphanage. I have no idea how the children ended up at this place or how Adia and Sid did, but much like Dumbledore's sexuality, I'm sure the devs may one day retcon this information that nobody asked for into the game. While at this orphanage, Galbadia Garden comes crashing in on the group and you end up fighting this massive battle of the two gardens. This part of the game is really cool, with a ton of really good FMV sequences. Squall has to allocate seed members to different positions as efficiently as possible, deploying the most skilled seeds where they are most needed, protecting the younger classmen and defending most of the vital areas, like the hot dog stand, a decision which I have zero regrets choosing. During this sequence, Zell absolutely needs to have Squall's ring, which apparently he wears over his gloves, which then Zell immediately gives to Rinoa. Then, Rinoa gets knocked over a ledge and begins clinging to a tiny-ass stone for dear life. No one can do anything about it, so they go get Squall and tell him to stop being a leader so he can rescue her. Squall is conflicted, as going to rescue her means he's no longer going to be the leader everybody needs him to be, but he also doesn't want to lose Rinoa. So Squall tells Zell to try and save her, but then Zell fails, like everything else in his life. Squall has to go help her, but then there are also other people he has to help along the way, and as he's doing such, he gets caught by a Galbadian soldier in what can only be described as a prototype flying power armor suit. This sequence has Squall and a Galbadian soldier duke it out in this amazingly detailed FMV sequence playing in the background. Unfortunately, you'll completely miss it as you'll be preoccupied trying not to die. A tough task, I assure you. I would call this the hardest fight in the game because the actual strategy the game wants you to use doesn't work half the damn time. So, after failing myself 4 times trying to get through this part of the game, Squall defeats the soldier and gets into the power armor to go and save Rinoa, who has been holding onto the side of a cliff for like at least 10 minutes. Like how fucking strong is her grip strength, man? The gardens have been banging each other constantly the whole time, and she's just like, yeah, nah, I have all the time in the world until you swoop in and rescue me, Squall. After Squall rescues her, the two use the power armor to land in some fields between the two gardens where they've collided. This allows Squall and the rest of the party to form a strike team to try and take out the enemy commander in order to quickly end the battle. You can actually miss a GF here, so make sure you fight Cerberus at the middle of the garden. You can also speak to Fujin and Raijin, who are just tired and want Cypher to stop his madness. Progressing into the final section of Galbadia Garden, Cypher is revealed to have a massive Chuni biocomplex and is now LARPing hardcore as the Sorceress's Knight. You have to fight Cypher, then move to a new area, then fight Cypher again in order to get to the Sorceress Adia for your final showdown. Make sure to draw Alexander from the Sorceress as he has some very strong skills, including a skill to get items required for another GF later in the game. Otherwise, you'll have to wait until Disc 4 to get Alexander. After pounding the Sorceress hard enough to make Sid jealous, another cutscene plays out with Sorceress Adia and Rinoa both collapsing. Adia soon recovers, but Rinoa ends up in a coma, and with this, the second disc ends. Disc 3 begins with Squall freaking out about Rinoa. He tries to talk to Adia and Sid about her, but neither have any clues as to what's happening. Adia had been possessed by a sorceress from the future named Ultimecia, who is seeking time compression for reasons that are never explained in detail in the game, but I suppose it doesn't really matter. For some reason, no one puts 2 and 2 together that Rinoa probably got possessed by Ultimecia after leaving Adia. I have always been confused by this scene. Like it's so obvious, yet no one even has a single modicum of thought that this could be the situation. Really? Without any leads to go on, Squall is depressed and decides to go see Rinoa. Here, the game is a bit weird with its instructions. It doesn't actually say anything about Squall needing to go actually see Rinoa to progress the story, but you do need to go see her. Squall freaks out about what's happening to her, and you can see that he truly cares about her by this point in the story. During this sequence, Squall falls asleep at her side and a new dream sequence begins. Laguna, Kyros, and Maybe Ward play part of a film fighting a ruby dragon. The sequence actually changes depending on whether or not you read the issue of Temper Maniacs at the Shui Village. Laguna, being a chronic terrible decision maker, has spent all the party's cash on MLM schemes, so they are taking part of a film in order to make some cash. Laguna plays the part of a sorceress's knight, defending her from harm. Here, you also see Laguna strike an interesting pose before going into battle with the Ruby Dragon. This pose is noteworthy because you should have seen it several times at this point in the game. It's the same pose Cypher strikes whenever he does pretty much anything involving his gunblade. Cypher was enamored by the idea of becoming a sorceress's knight due to a film he saw as a young boy. That film is this film that Laguna is currently acting in. There's another battle sequence similar to Squall and the power armor soldier from earlier, but this one's significantly easier. Afterwards, Laguna and company must fight a Rupee Dragon in a legitimate fight. You will be given an option before fighting the Rupee Dragon with Hold On, allowing you to take a chance to change your junctioning. But every time I do this fight, I forget to do that, and as such, I just have to fight the fight with only Laguna junctioned, resulting in Gyros and Ward dying early on as I take my time shooting the dragon to death. Dragons may be resistant to swords and magic in most fantasy stories, but I've yet to hear a story about a bulletproof dragon, so Laguna just guns it down like a pro and ends the dream sequence. Squall has a short dream conversation with Alone and then wakes up. It's at this moment he decides he needs to go get with Alone so she can send him back in time to see what happened to Rinoa. As such, he goes back to Adia and speaks with her. He now has a new goal of tracking down the White Seed ship, which isn't too hard as they're not too far away and the only boat in the actual game which you can see in the overworld. Even with a letter from Adia, the White Seeds don't trust you and tell you to leave. You should speak to all the NPCs here and get some more background information about the recent events. You'll also find Watson Zone, who has finally learned how to handle pressure as he tries to pick a fight with Squall for somehow causing Rinoa's coma. He instantly forgives Squall once you give him a porn magazine. Talking to the leader of White Seed reveals that Galbadia actually intercepted them earlier, but as they were about to be attacked, an Esthar ship came to rescue them. Alone went with them back to Esthar. So now aware of this, Squall leaves the White Seed ship. I recommend going back and talking to the teacher White Seed at the nose of the ship as she has some more interesting information about Hein, the deity of the world of FF8. Hein created humans to do his work for him since he was a lazy fuck. He fell asleep for a long time and when he woke up, there were too many humans. So he tried to genocide them, only to realize that there were so many humans that he couldn't win. Hein decided to have a ceasefire and would give the humans half of his body in the peace deal, theoretically giving the humans half of his power. Except that didn't work. The body was useless and all of Hein's magic was apparently kept in his other half of his body. That said, I guess the body he gave the humans wasn't completely useless as I guess someone banged it and gave birth to the first sorceress. The game doesn't really explain the method, but that's my headcanon. The stronger Hein's blood is in a sorceress, the more similar they are to him. Remember this bit for later. After speaking with her and getting some lore, Squall has to go back to Garden. He then has to go and visit Rinoa, unprompted once again. Like, he literally goes, "Set course for Esthar!" And the game just assumes you, as the player, will know you must go speak to Rinoa again, prompting Squall to go AWOL, completely abandoning his duty as the leader of Seed, kidnapping a comatose Rinoa, and heading towards Esthar on foot, completely forgetting the fact that Garden is most likely in the middle of the fucking ocean right now, so there's nowhere for him to actually go. The pilot for Garden automatically brings Garden to Fisherman's Horizon for some reason. No idea why he decided that's what Squall meant by set course for Esthar, but that's where he is. Then, Squall stealthily sneaks out of Garden with his comatose girlfriend on his back. I guess this is just another skill he learned while training. He piggybacks her all the way across the railroad, which crosses the entire fucking ocean, connecting two continents. This is basically half the world's equator. Like, no one mentions this or how absurd this should be. When I was a kid, I figured transoceanic railways must be some common thing in the real world because otherwise, no one would ever think this would be a reasonable thing in the game, right? Well no, Kid Me was stupid. The concept itself is stupid. Like, I really like trains, but couldn't a random fucking wave knock trains off the tracks constantly? How long would it even take for a train to go from like New York to Lisbon, or LA to Tokyo? It's fucking insane. And nobody really explains it in FF8. I just assumed that Esthar wanted to more easily invade Galbadia, so they just built a big-ass railway to get there more easily. That'd be like if China wanted to invade the US, so they just built a huge fucking railway over the ocean to get to us. It's absurd. And I love it. This needs to be a real thing, guys. But enough of that tangent. Squall talks a lot to Rinoa and finally realizes he loves her. He talks about how he was afraid of overly relying on others and what they thought about him. The reason why he was so antisocial between people is because it made it easier for him to interact with others that way. If he didn't consider them as friends, he wouldn't feel bad if they perceived him to be mean or rude or whatever. This might be really weird if you're extroverted, a completely alien concept to you, but for an introvert it's not that out there. Maybe not something common to all introverts, but common enough that it's actually pretty realistic. After Squall's monologue, he continues carrying Rinoa with him across the transoceanic railway, getting to the other end where he is met by the rest of his party and Adia, who somehow got to the other side before him? Like, how the fuck did they do that? Especially without passing Squall first. It's the only way to Esthar. Did they like sneak by him while he was sleeping specifically to surprise him at this point? I mean, maybe. That's the only explanation I can come up with, so it's now canon because I say so. So Squall reunites with everyone, and now Adia is a temporary party member. You can use her to level up your GS without leveling up the rest of your party, and by that I mean knocking them out so they don't receive experience. After that, there's a weird dungeon called the Great Salt Lake, proving that FF8 really does take place in a dystopic future of Earth where the Mormons try taking over the world. Unfortunately, in the future, Utah's Great Salt Lake has dried up and is now a bunch of salt pillars, probably constructed out of the tears of people who have been offended by all the jokes I've made in this video. Actually, when I was younger, I thought this was all snow and was super confused why there was snow just in this one random ass location, whereas all the other snow in the world was way the fuck up north. Shotomi had a lot of misconceptions of this game. Progressing through this dungeon, you fight the scariest boss of the game, who goes down in one hit if you rub some fire chicken feathers on it. Afterwards, Squall and company run along the edge of the dried lake until they find a glitch in the Matrix. They climb up an invisible ladder and find out that Utah conquered the entirety of America, forming one massive super city, which is now called Esther. Upon their initial arrival to Esther, Squall and company go into another dream sequence. Laguna's party was caught illegally crossing the border and were taken to a migrant camp. While there, Laguna makes friends with some furries and uses their masses of furry wealth to stage a coup against the government of this nation. This nation was being controlled by a sorceress named Adele who wanted a loan for her powers. Laguna lures Adele into a trap and seals her into a pod and launches her into the fucking moon. It's fucking awesome. Though technically this scene showing the last part comes later in the game. I really think it should have been included here though. Also, when I was younger, Adele made me super confused. Like, she looks like a man, but as I mentioned earlier, apparently the stronger a sorceress is, the more blood of Hein they have, which causes them to look more like Hein. Presumably, that's why Adele looks like a fucking giantess muscle dude, bro. She feels a lot of fetishes. Anyway, with that, the dream sequence ends. Squall and company go find Dr. Odine, who will help Squall on the condition that Squall leaves Rhinoa's comatose body with him. Squall has no qualms with this idea for some reason and instead goes to a place called the Lunar Gate, where you find out Estar sends people to space by loading them into space pods and shooting them into space with a fucking railgun. Completely scientifically accurate, I assure you. For some reason, Dr. Odine sent Rhino up to space as well. I have no real idea why, as I don't think they ever discussed it with Squall. Like, Squall needs Rhinoa with him so Alone can use her powers, so I know Squall would want her on the space station with him, but he doesn't know about Lunar Base until after getting to the Lunar Gate, which Rhinoa has already been loaded onto a space pod and launched into space. But whatever, I recommend talking to all the NPCs around the station to find out some more background information of the story. This base was built to keep an eye on Sorceress Adele. The president of Estar does routine inspections on the seal himself in order to ensure that Adele stays sealed. Also, the monsters of this world are born on the moon, and every so often they glum together and form a monster elevator that goes all the way to Earth, where they can all fly through space to land on the surface of the planet in a process called the Lunar Cry. Which brings me to what the rest of the party is doing down in Estar. Squall could only go to the lunar base with Rhinoa and one other party member. That other party member literally serves no purpose as there's no combat on the lunar base, but the rest of your party does have to fight. Galbadia has scavenged a device called the Lunatic Pandora, which will call monsters from the moon to fall on the planet at that specific point, wherever the Pandora is located. The party that you left behind in Estar have to jump onto the Lunatic Pandora to try and stop it, which they fail. After this, the game returns back to Squall and his adventures on the space station. Squall finds Alone and wants to go take her to Rhinoa, who has been placed in a stasis pod thing so she can use her powers. Suddenly, sirens start blaring out and Squall finds Rhinoa awake, but possessed by something. While you would think that this is a vital time of importance, the proper thing to do at this point is to challenge Alone to triple Triad, as she carries Laguna's card, and you will not get another chance until the 4th disc to get it. Alone will be shocked that you want to play cards with her at a time like this, but is perfectly fine forgetting the danger at present to play some fucking cards. Afterwards, Squall tries and fails to prevent Rhinoa from going into space and releasing the seal on Sorceress Adele. The lunar cry starts and the space station has to be evacuated. The stream of monsters from the moon pours onto the world below, with Adele being brought along with them. Squall and Alone get into an escape pod together, where Alone finally sends Squall back in time to see what happened to Rhinoa. Here, you see Rhinoa forcing Irvine to go back to the prison to rescue Squall and everyone back at the beginning of Disc 2, and a bunch of other wholesome scenes. Then it finally shows what happened to her at the end of Disc 2, where she went comatose. She got possessed by Ultimecia after Adia lost the fight. What a surprise! Who would have ever known that that was the case? I had absolutely no idea. So yeah, Squall acts like this is new information. Then you see Rinoa freaking out that she's going to die in space and about to give up. So Squall launches himself into space to go be by her side. Being her knight in shining armor, he does that. He catches her up in space, and then they realize that neither of them have a way back home. So now they are both going to die from space's alleged lack of oxygen. Great plan, Squall. Suddenly, God throws a spaceship at them, so they get on board and find out this is what was used to launch Adele into space 17 years prior. Like when Squall and Rinoa first get on the spaceship, there's aliens on board, so it's implied that the crew were killed by aliens back when they sealed Adele, but they really should have built this up better. Like during the dream sequence with Laguna joining the Resistance, they should have shown the sequence where he captures and launches Adele into space. Then they should show Adele getting taken up to space and could have had something referring to how this spaceship, called Ragnarok, got lost. Maybe have a scene where it lands on the moon so that the team can confirm that Adele is securely fastened to the crypt, but then gets swarmed by filthy xenomorphs. There could have been dialogue while on lunar base talking about how the ship was abandoned due to the danger and was left really close to Adele's crypt. But when the lunar cry actually began, they could have had an FMV where the Ragnarok was tossed out into space from the force of all the monsters rushing through it. That way it would have made sense for it to be randomly floating close to Rinoa and Squall. Unfortunately, as things stand the way they are, it's just Deus Ex Machina. This is the one instance in the game that I really can't defend. All I can really do is suggest improvements in case they ever want to remake this game later, but it's just bad as it is. This scene, I mean. That said, it's the only major grievance I have with the plot of the game, despite all the sarcasm and jokes about the plot I've made thus far. I'll get more into this in the analysis section of the video, but since this scene was so bad narratively speaking, I had to talk about it immediately, I felt. The ship, Ragnarok, has been taken over by the aforementioned filthy xenomorphs, and Squall, as all humans should do, purges them all. Squall then pilots it back to the world, and a really wholesome moment between he and Rinoa happens, with Eyes on Me playing in the background. This is a very deep and emotional moment, like no sarcasm this time. This entire sequence is fantastic and has a great musical score to accompany it as Rinoa and Squall finally confirm their feelings for each other. Unfortunately, Square Enix has very strict copyright concerns for the scene here, so instead of hearing an amazingly beautiful song here, you will hear my amazingly shitty a cappella version of it. Squall is able to come back down to the world below by being guided by the Lunar Gate radio command. They land, Rinoa gets taken by Estar so they can seal her, and Squall is all like, well, that was her choice, so what right do I have to interfere? Which I kind of actually understand. I really support the idea of we all having to make our own choices in life, and it's not appropriate to interfere with the decisions another person makes, so long as it doesn't cause harm to another person, or prevents another person from exercising their free will. However, there are certain times when I think you should interfere, and I think this is one of them. Squall is super bad with people and doesn't realize it, but Rinoa really didn't want to get taken away. She literally says several times that she had to, but Squall confuses this thinking that she was saying that she wanted to. When the rest of the party makes Squall realize this, he frees her and almost gets arrested for it. But one of the president of Estar's aides rescues them. He's a tall dude, but refuses to speak to you when you try to talk to him. Obviously someone you've never seen before, right? After escaping from Estar, the party flies to the orphanage where Rinoa talks about being scared of being possessed again and how the whole world will come to hate her. Rinoa talks about having night horrors of being all alone and desperately searching for Squall, but not being able to find him. Squall promises that if Rinoa ever is lost, she can find him back at this orphanage, alluding to the game's opening sequence. It is then revealed that the president of Estar wants to speak to Squall and company, as they have a plan on defeating both Adele and Ultimecia. Squall, who doesn't know that the president is Laguna yet, is a bit suspicious, but decides to go speak with him anyway. At this point of the game, you have access to several optional side quests. I highly recommend doing all of them before going to Estar, as you are almost at the point of no return. Once Disc 3 ends, you lose access to basically every city in the game, as Disc 4 is just one dungeon essentially. So, for now, if you are playing the game, go do all the side quests you want before continuing on with the plot. I also usually use this part of the game to finally level up my characters. At this point, you may have a bunch of stat bonus skills on your GFs that increase the amount of stats you gain by leveling up, so I like to level everyone up to level 100 at this point. I mentioned some side quests earlier when you get Balam Garden Mobile, but now you have access to Cator Island, which has the Cator GF, which possesses all the stat bonus skills as well, the islands closest to Heaven and Hell, the Poo Poo side quest, the Obel Lake side quest, and my personal favorite, the Deep Sea Research Facility. There's like no information on this side dungeon and it doesn't even show up on the map. I love it when games reward you for actually exploring their vast overworlds, as you may go through the entire game never encountering this place. It's just over in the corner of the map where you have no reason to ever go, but if you do, you'll find this place. You can see it while piloting Balam Garden, but you can't access it until you get the Ragnarok. And when inside, you'll be introduced to a run-down research facility that was doing something in the middle of the ocean. You don't know what, but why not explore it to find out? There's a core in the center of the first room you enter, so why not walk over there? Oh, what's this? A shining blue light. You get an encounter every time you step when the light comes on, but not when it's off. Okay, so just walk over to the other side of the room towards the core and activate it. Walk when the light isn't shining. Oh, something's talking to you now. Oh, and here's another battle with a ruby dragon. Why that? Once they're dead, there's more dialogue, and then the same thing happens. On the third dialogue option, you'll finally get your reward. You get to fight Bahamut, who looks super badass and has some pretty good abilities you can unlock. After this fight, the room changes and you can climb down a hole in the floor. And this is the first part of the Deep Sea Research Facility. You have to have at least 10 pressure points to activate the final part of this dungeon, which you can only do if you bring Zell with you through this section. So make sure if you played through this part, to bring him. Maybe use a guide to make sure you don't mess it up, because at the end of this dungeon, you'll end up at the bottom of the research facility and meet the reason why this place became abandoned. Say hello to the Ultima weapon. This is the second strongest boss in the game. Like, no jokes this time, it actually is really strong. It also has the strongest GF in the game on him, so make sure you draw it before killing him. This boss is no pushover, but it pales in comparison to the actual hardest boss in the game, but we'll get to that one later. For now, do your best at both drawing the GF and actually defeating the boss. This boss used to give me nightmares when I was a Shota, but since I've beaten the game so much, I now excel at exploiting all of this game's systems. But for a new player, this will be very difficult for you. And in addition to the strongest GF, what are you rewarded with? 100 Ultima Stones. These can refine into the Ultima spell, meaning one of your party members will now be able to have 100 Ultima stocks just like that. Ultima is the best junctioning magic in the game, so be happy with that. And this is also the last chance you'll have to play cards with almost everyone in the game, so make sure you do that before you go speak with Laguna. And with that, it's time to continue on with the plot. Back at the Presidential Palace of Esther, Laguna informs Squall that they don't need to seal Renoa because he has a brilliant trademarked plan to save the world. You see, Ultimecia seeks time compression. That means she wants to use time magic to make every moment of time happen concurrently. Simply put, she wants the past, present, and future to all happen at the same time. How would that work? No idea. But for this to happen, Ultimecia needs a loan for her vaguely explained time travel ability. So, Laguna's plan? Give Ultimecia what she wants. Brilliant, isn't it? They will kill Adele so that Ultimecia has to possess Renoa, at which point a loan will send both Renoa and Ultimecia's consciousnesses back into child Adele. Then she will pull Renoa back, but leave Ultimecia back in time. How does this stop Ultimecia from collapsing all the timelines completely? I have no fucking idea. I have no idea why she needs to go back in time to do this to begin with. Apparently in the future, Dr. Odine built a machine that works similar to Alone's powers. Ultimecia went back in time, but couldn't go back any further than she currently is. So, that's why she needs Alone's power to send her even further back. To what point? The game never explains, but once she gets Child Adele, time compression begins. But I'm jumping ahead of myself a bit. Squall and company break into Lunatic Pandora and fight Fujin and Raijin, who, after being beaten, force you to fight their robot. After fighting the robot, they finally decide to stop helping Cypher, at which point Cypher does his Kuni pose one last time and you have to duel him. If you have Odin, he will try to attack Cypher only to be bisected by Cypher. It's pretty badass, not gonna lie. At this point, Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy V appears out of fucking nowhere and takes Odin's place for the rest of the game. The thing with Gilgamesh is that he can be summoned at any point in battle, whereas Odin only comes in at the very beginning. Gilgamesh has 4 attacks instead of Odin's possible 1, but don't worry too much about that. For the record, Cypher also has aura spells drawable from him. I highly recommend getting 100 on all your characters, as this spell will allow you to use limit breaks even when her HP is full. After this, Cypher kidnaps Rinoa, despite having just been beaten, and offers her to Adele, who somehow fuses Rinoa's hands into her chest, and is really weird. She's not hard though, so just kill her. At this point, time compression begins, and the party has to fight the sorceresses throughout time. Or maybe just the sorceresses between the 2 points in time when Ultimecia is and when she started time compression? I'm not really sure, the game doesn't really explain how time compression works. And based off how they tried explaining this part of the game as is, I don't think I want them to try to elaborate any further. It makes more sense to me that Ultimecia is trying to collapse time in between 2 points in time. Why does she need to go back to a certain point? Why not just use time compression immediately? So that's what I'm going with, even if it's not exactly canon. Once the sorceresses are defeated, everyone somehow ends up in the orphanage, which is now linked to Ultimecia's castle. Time compression is beginning, but it seems like, for whatever reason, not everything phases out of existence immediately. Whatever the party has a strong attachment to will persist into the time-compressed world, including each other. I think what the game tries to explain is that the team has a limited amount of time before they phase out of existence, but it does not explain this very well. There are some dialogue lines that suggest this. I believe they're all locked behind whether or not you completed a certain side quest earlier. Did you do the CC card group side quest? I hope so, because you can now use the chocobos from the Chocobo Forest side quest line to go find the Ragnarok in this time-compressed world, on which the CC group is now taken up residence. You can duel them for a lot of rare cards for card modding purposes, but the actual reason you want to do this is because now you can card mod any of your unique cards and then duel the people on Ragnarok to win those cards back. You can mod some of the best items in the game this way. For example, Gilgamesh refines into 10 holy wars, which makes your entire party completely untargetable by any attack. If you refine Gilgamesh, you can then win them back from dueling the CC members. I recommend the left diamond girl, as she seems to have a higher chance of using unique cards. The only card that I'm not certain this works on is Poo Poo, since it's only a level 5 card, but all the GS and character cards work this way. Ragnarok is pilotable at this point, but all the cities in the world are inaccessible, so you can really only do just a couple things, like grinding cactuars for AP. I believe the Deep Sea Research Facility is also available if you did not do that in Disc 3. After this, you can go to any of the gateways on the overworld map to get back to Ultimecia's castle. Upon entering Ultimecia's castle, you will lose all your abilities on your party except for normal attacks. The party splits into two and you will operate both parties, going back and forth between them in order to solve puzzles in this dungeon to fight a bunch of bosses. Each boss you defeat, you can choose one of your actions to regain function of, like limit breaks, items, or, whatever else. If you ever need to heal or save, just leave the castle and use the save point outside of it. You are only inhibited while inside the castle. Also, a thing to note, several GFs can be drawn from these bosses if you missed them earlier in the game. The game only ever forces you to have 3 GFs, which lets you have at least one full party of GF users. All other GFs are completely optional, and the GFs you find here are ones that should be impossible to obtain now. GFs you can find with the Ragnarok you can still go get, like Tonberry, Cactuar, the Brothers, or Bahamut. The only exception is Eden, which you can either do the side quest in the Deep Sea Research Facility, or you can get it from Tiamat from Ultimecia's castle. Just be aware of that when you go through the castle. Different bosses have specific GFs they will have access to, so get the draw command unlocked before you go and fight those specific bosses. Aside from that, you don't have to fight any of the bosses in this dungeon. You could go fight the final boss with just the attack command, but it's substantially easier if you unlock everything, which is what I recommend. Oh, also you can fight the game's hardest boss, the Omega Weapon. It's the hardest boss in the game, and at level 100 it has nearly 1.2 million HP. It uses attacks in a specific pattern, which basically requires you always healing whenever you take any damage whatsoever, and even using the defend command. It's the only battle in the game I have ever seen people use the defend command on. I completely forgot that defend was even a command in this game to begin with. After learning its moveset, you should be able to defeat it. I recommend using Meltdown or Doom Train to get its fatality to 0, and then use Aura to start spamming limit breaks, then use Mega Elixirs whenever it attacks at all. This probably means you'll need the item command on every party member, also a lot of Mega Elixirs. Luckily, you can get those by refining the Bahamut card into them, or you can use the aforementioned Holy Wars to make your entire party impervious to damage and spam limit breaks to cheese Omega. Just make sure to cast Aura beforehand, because you can't use them when your party is already Holy Ward. And with that, the hardest boss in the game will be dealt with. But that doesn't mean the rest of the game is a slouch either. The final boss actually game over to me my first try when I was recording this video. Speaking of, after killing all the bosses in Omega, there's really only one thing left to do. Fighting the final boss. At the end of the castle, Ultimecia speaks in a future language where all the hard letter C sounds have been replaced with the letter K, a change I wholly welcome. C should only ever be used when immediately followed by an H, but that's an issue we can ignore for the sake of keeping this video at a reasonable 4-hour length. Ultimecia randomly chooses 3 of your party members to fight at this moment, probably because Squaresoft wanted you to have to use your entire party in this final battle, but really, why would you bother? When someone dies in this battle, they'll be replaced by another party member after a short period of time. If all 3 party members die before they get replaced, you'll get the game over though, which is why I game overed here. Her first 2 phases are pretty easy, but the 3rd and 4th phases are actually things you'll need to pay attention to. She has an attack that brings your entire party to 1 HP. But after defeating her, the game ends. The party gets lost in space-time as they try to travel back to their original time period as time compression begins to reverse. They all have to truly desire to go to a specific point with one another in order to reach it, the location they chose being Adia's orphanage. Squall, however, just fucks off and goes back in time to when he was 4. He greets a younger Adia who then inherits Ultimecia's powers. Squall tells her about how she forms Garden in order to defeat the sorceress and then leaves that timeline to meet up with everyone. Apparently in this short interaction, Adia and Sid immediately decide to close the orphanage and train child soldiers instead, a decision I'm not sure most people would agree with. I wasn't really sure why they were so gung-ho about this, but the Legend of Final Fantasy VIII book offered some insight into this. Sid and Adia were taking care of the kids orphaned by the Sorceress's War, caused by Sorceress Adele. They didn't want this to happen again, so they formed Garden in order to prevent the same thing happening to a future generation of children. Now, this is not exactly a canon explanation, but it seems to make the most sense as to why Adia and Sid just suddenly decided to agree to build Garden. It was the only explanation I could find though, so let's just go with that. Unfortunately, Squall wasted too much time and begins to fade away from existence. Rinoa, presumably due to being a sorceress who probably has some game-breaking bullshit magic, is able to search the dimensions beyond space-time to find Squall and bring him back into existence. Everyone is able to get together and have one final celebration on Garden as the game goes through an epilogue scene. Cypher, Fujin, and Raijin are now hanging out like bros on the pier, fishing. This life probably a better one than Cypher would have ever had in Garden to begin with, as he finally gives up his Chunibyo dreams of becoming a sorceress's knight to actually live a decent life for once. Zell ends up with a librarian girl, who apparently has a side quest to matchmake with Zell, which I had no idea existed until after finishing this game, and as such I have no footage of. Is what I would say if I didn't want to make this the very best fucking FF8 video I possibly could. So instead, I went back and restarted the game from the very beginning and played all the way up to Disc 3 to do this whole side quest for this one part of the video. Because even if it means almost nothing in the long run, I really wanted to have footage for everything I talked about. Anyway, now that I spent an extra 20 hours playing the game in order to get 10 seconds of footage, let's continue. Irvine is hitting it off with Selphie, who is running around the party with a video camera. At the end, Rinoa is seen speaking to someone when the camera cuts out due to a low battery. However, waiting through all the credits shows she was actually speaking to Squall, which is rather obvious. But they are finally together at last and sail off to a new and brighter future. The end. So, that was a rather long plot synopsis, but I had to go through all of it in order to give this game a full analysis. The way this analysis portion of the video will go is that I will talk about what worked in the game's plot and what didn't and how it could have been improved. I will also address common criticisms of the game that aren't related to the plot specifically. This will be things like gameplay, character personalities and development, and other issues people seem to have taken with the game. Note that this following portion of the video is going to be much more serious than the plot summary. Well, maybe not completely. Anyway, the game starts out with one of the coolest FMVs at the time. The music choice was perfect and the animation was flawless. I think the opening is good, but there are random parts that cut away from the ongoing fight between Cypher and Squall. There are also random lines of text that break up the FMV and halt it. While neither of these issues are terrible, I think this opening could be improved, removing the text dialogue, or just shortening it to 1 or 2 lines instead of repeating itself over and over. There's another YouTube channel called Resonant Arc, which did their own podcast over FF8, which I watched after writing the script, and they also suggested an improvement that I actually thought was a great idea, better than what I came up with anyway. Instead of having random scenes break up the fight, these scenes should have happened, but Squall should just look quizzically at the camera or Cypher in a manner that the audience would know he was seeing the same things that we as the audience were seeing. It would be these distractions that caused Squall to get injured and could be weaved into the narrative that these were Squall experiencing some sort of foreshadowing of the time conversion that comes later in the game. Something Resident Arc did talk about was how maybe the game should have begun where the demo did, which was at the Dalit Seed mission, though I think maybe this opening is a bit better. Both FF6 and 7 started in the middle of major story actions, so 8's was a good break from that, which is what Square was aiming for. It doesn't take too long to get to that part of the game anyway. And just introducing Squall and allowing him to have a tutorial to go around Garden while only having to worry about one person at this time works pretty well. While Garden is pretty big, it has a pretty simple layout, so it's not very hard to navigate, and the directory lets you fast travel to different points. As such, it shouldn't take too long or be hard to find the front entrance where Keistis is waiting for you to show up so she can give you the first game's tutorial. This is a good point to talk about the game's tutorials, which suck ass. To this date, I have not actually finished reading through an entire FF8 tutorial. I learned everything through trial and error. The only boon that these tutorials have is that you can cancel them out at any time. Really, the game should just go, you don't have MP, but instead you get your magic like an item, which can be equipped to your stats. That's it. Maybe a more hands-on tutorial that teaches you how to draw magic and then tells you can equip these spells to your stats depending on your DS abilities, but everything is super obvious, so that's probably unnecessary. Neither FF6 nor 7 spend that much time explaining the magicite or the materia system, and that's very intuitive. I don't think FF8 is that much more complex, just the tutorials made it out like it is. They should be more simple and more hands-on. For example, how to get magic injunction it? The tutorial could spawn an enemy that Squall can draw from, then end the battle and bring up the equipment menu, go to junction, and then junction E3 or something, equip that spell to Squall's strength to show it. Make it like 15 seconds at most. The tutorials as they stand waste time and are so slow. Why does the text crawl like this? It's unnecessary. Card Mod doesn't have a tutorial, but a majority of the players of this game know how that works just by playing the game. Then they abuse it whenever they replay the game, but that's how games are in general. So in conclusion, either remove the tutorials or make them substantially better, like how I suggested just a bit earlier. After this tutorial, the Dalit section begins, and I just want to say, I think this section of the game is perfect. The player is introduced to Cypher, Squall's rival, and gives you an idea of what kind of person he is, and introduces Zell as well, and how this group gets along, or rather how they don't. Yet, they are supposed to be professionals, and this will be one of the criteria they'll be judged on. Secondly, the FMV that starts here with the music that plays is absolutely perfect. I can see why they started the demo at this point. You're introduced to what kind of work Seed is expected to perform, and are introduced to Galbadia being the invading empire in this game. Cypher is shown to be a bit of a hothead who just wants a good fight, and Selphie is also introduced. And then you find out that the radio tower is the reason Galbadia invaded, which is enough of a hint to tell you that something's going on with the communications in this world. This boss fight with Chevrolet introduces to the player that you can draw DS from certain enemies, and then follows up with a quick-pace, high-stakes chase, which, if you know how to manipulate, you can easily escape, but for a new player, they'll be very panicked during this time trying to escape, which is what you want for this kind of mission. It ends with a really cool FMV and then has the graduation announcement scene, which then turns to the dancing scene. Here, Rinoa is introduced as a bit of an extrovert who would dance with a random dude she's never met before. Squall is shown to be terrible with social interactions, or maybe just terrible with women, which I can relate. But it's just enough to also show the player that these two are probably going to end up together by the end of the game. Squall has a super antisocial moment with Keistis, which I will get to Squall's personality and character development after the plot analysis section, but I think it works really well here. This entire section with Keistis is very realistic in my opinion, taking into account that Squall is an introvert. You have a teacher who abused her authority to get the guy she had a crush on, whom is also her student, to listen to her worries. Due to having bad taste, the guy, Squall, has zero interest in her and clearly thinks there's something wrong with the teacher wanting to shag her student, which, I mean, while hot, is actually a fair assessment from Squall's part. He doesn't want to be here, he's not interested, and she's overstepping the boundaries of teacher-student relationships. Squall is completely in the right here to respond to Keistis in the way in which he does. After this scene, the player is reintroduced to Alone, who you only get a glance at right at the start of the game. It's hard to talk about Alone without talking about the Amnesia side plot. Squall is now 13-ish years older, and it would make sense for him to kind of remember having a big sis, but almost completely forgetting her by the time the game begins, as he hasn't seen her since he was almost 4-ish. During this scene with Squall and Quistis, I think it would have been a good opportunity for Squall to have his first big sis scene. Or maybe even a memory of Alone and Squall as children showing up at the orphanage, being introduced to the other children, with Shota Squall hiding behind his big sis's back. I really want to see some fan art of that, by the way. But anyway, maybe hide everyone's faces in the flashback somehow, but this could definitely make the amnesia plot to be less weird, or just completely removed from the game. And just in general, most of the kids got adopted or sent to the gardens and had around 13 years of the life outside of the orphanage. They could almost keep the amnesia scene as is, and just be like, oh, Irvine got sent to a garden by himself, and so he didn't have many close friends and always remembered his friends from the orphanage, which is why he has a stronger memory of it. Everybody else would just have become a shonen anime protagonist and forgot all about their childhood friends. And they could sprinkle in some dialogue suggesting that everyone else except Rinoa were at an orphanage when they were kids. Hell, Cypher, Squall, and Quistis at the very least have no excuse for not recognizing each other as is. At least Zell had a loving family up until he enrolled at Garden, so there's an excuse for him. Selphie even mentioned one of the reasons why she thinks she forgot was because she had so many good friends and memories at Triad Garden. So, with all of this in mind, I think the best way to fix Alone and the amnesia sections of the game would be to completely remove the amnesia altogether, and just have more breadcrumbs for the player to come to the conclusion that the party grew up together themselves before they actually reveal it, and have them reveal who Alone is while following this breadcrumb trail. Then, the player wouldn't be confused when Alone suddenly appears in the third dream sequence. On the contrary, players would see Alone and be like, oh, so that's what these Laguna sections are going to be about. It would make intentions a whole lot more obvious for the player without feeling like they're just having the carpet yanked out from under them, by suddenly going, oh yeah, everybody totally has amnesia. Like, I swear, JRPGs must be contractually obligated to have main characters with amnesia or something, and they have to also kill God. Speaking of Laguna, his group is absolutely perfect, and I wouldn't change any of the scenes involving them. Only the last dream sequence should have Adele being launched into space, which I mentioned earlier. Actually, something I really want to point out is, and I mentioned this earlier, the scenes in-game actually change depending on whether or not you read the Timber Maniacs magazines at certain parts of the game prior to those dream sequences. This is great game design, as you can get different experiences playing the game multiple times and finding new scenes for your favorite characters. Which, let's be honest, Laguna is everyone's favorite in this game. Even though I hated this section when I was a kid, because I really like Squall. For some reason, to my child brain, that meant I wasn't allowed to like Laguna. And the Man with the Machine Gun BGM, which is one of the coolest battle themes in the series. I love it, but child me thought I wasn't allowed to love it, so I didn't. Anyway, I really like the Laguna portions of the game, and one of the things I hear from almost everybody about this game is that they also enjoy Laguna. I don't have much to suggest for improvements, except maybe making them playable during Disc 4 for Ultimecia's castle, as they are now united with Squall's party. However, this isn't really a required improvement, it's just something I would have enjoyed personally. Otherwise, the dream sequences are pretty nice. They introduce the player to different parts of the game before the player actually goes there with Squall. It gives a lot of lore and sets up the love story between Squall and Rinoa, since their parents used to be in love until separated by war. It's rather poetic. The dream sequences are great. What isn't great is how the game makes you pay for your own train tickets. Fuck that. I really like how you have a salary in the game since you're technically an employee of a mercenary group. I like how many events in this game actually influence your ranking in this mercenary group, though you can also just cheat it by taking and passing a bunch of tests. The system of garden ranks is actually pretty cool. I like the system. But seriously, remove the need for the player to pay for their own tickets. At least the initial ticket. Like, all the other traveling expenses are optional, like renting a car or taking a train later after the initial train ride. Luckily, it doesn't take too long to get your paycheck, so if you do spend all your money before buying a train ticket, it won't take long to get the money back, but it's still inconvenient. This is just a minor complaint, but still would like to see it removed from the game. After this first train ride, Squall is reunited with Rinoa. This entire group, the Forest Owls objectively suck ass. The game, thus far, has a very serious tone, yet here you have some Scooby-Doo gang with no real motivations trying to capture the evil empire's national leader with a half-baked scheme. A half-baked scheme that actually works, mind you. But really, how can you take this group seriously? Luckily, they don't play into the plot anymore after this, but at this point, it just seems way too goofy for the overall tone of the game. To improve this part of the game, I would recommend making this group an actual serious freedom fighters group rather than a walking sitcom. Or keep them as the walking sitcom, but have Squall and his party come up with the actual plan. A plan that probably shouldn't involve jumping trains and attaching and deattaching carts as shown in the actual game. Nothing about this makes sense. They got the exact dimensions and decoration of the train cart, but didn't get any information about how the person on the train cart was a fake. Also, how did the final two carts catch back up to the conductor train at the end here? It has no engine, so it should have slowed down, not sped up. I can't take this seriously at all. I think Squall coming up with the plan would make the scene more realistic, or making the Forest Towers an actual group of freedom fighters instead of whatever they currently are. After this failed kidnapping attempt, the game does foreshadow the communications issues this world has again. This TV monitor where Squall basically voices all of my complaints about the Forest Owls to Rinoa actually has some interesting text. It's impossible to read without freezing it somehow, but it actually does show some foreshadowing, specifically with Adele, who is the reason the radio noise exists in this world. The messages on the screen say, "I am alive, bring me back there. I will never let you forget about me, and I will never let you bound me back." Whatever the last one means, I have no idea. The president also mentions it being the first live broadcast in 17 years not done through HD cables. I really like that they're foreshadowing Adele, as her addition to the story doesn't seem as superfluous as certain other individuals, or like Necron from FF9, but that's a completely different game, so like most of my problems in life, I'll ignore that one for now. I think it's best for me to go ahead and talk about the biggest issue with the game, and truthfully, it's not something I can defend, as how it is, it's just absolutely terrible. I am, of course, referring to how you can't bang Quistis. She's hot, she wears leather, and she uses a whip in combat. How the fuck is she not a romance option? Look at this figure. It's insulting not to be able to get with her. Ventus Will syndrome strikes again, it seems. But no, the Squall Rinoa romance is actually pretty good, I think. As long as you don't pick the ellipses every time Squall speaks, then their romantic development grows pretty well. Also, if you choose the correct instruments during the Fisherman's Horizon concert, they have a really heartfelt conversation. I really like how they give the player choice and how their relationship develops, but on the other hand, if you don't choose the correct options, their relationships do not build in a natural fashion. I hate saying it, but in this case, maybe they should have just removed these options in order to better service their romance. Or they could have mandatory events that the player has no influence over that help develop their romance, just in case the player constantly picks the less romantic options involving Rinoa. At least that way, there is something to develop, and it doesn't just come out of left field. Just like the actual worst thing in the game, which is the Deus Ex Machina with Ragnarok. So, unfortunately, this is just terrible writing at this part. It's not something I can defend, so I won't. But I will suggest how they could have had the same scene and have it not be a Deus Ex. During the final dream sequence involving Laguna's crew, Laguna decides to overthrow Sorceress Adele, and then the dream sequence just ends. Later on, when Squall meets President Laguna, Squall can ask about how he became president, which it then has a flashback showing Laguna tricking Adele into getting sealed, and then launching her into space with the Ragnarok spaceships. This scene should have been in the same dream sequence as with Laguna breaking out of the labor camp in Esther. During this scene, one of the Ragnarok ships should have landed on the moon in order to finish the sealing process, and there could have been a scene with the crew screaming they're being attacked by monsters and the lunar base loses communication with them. This could be why Laguna decides to go and do checkups on the seal himself in order to keep his people safe. It also would mean that Ragnarok would be located pretty close to Adele's seal on the surface of the moon. When the lunar cry happens in the game, part of the FMV that plays during that part should have the monsters knock the Ragnarok off the surface of the moon, which would then shoot towards the world below. This would knock Ragnarok into orbit around the moon, where Rinoa and Squall will encounter it later during their cutscene together. This way, it would not come completely out of nowhere, and it would keep the overall plot the same. Every cutscene prior to this and after this scene would be the exact same. The Deus Ex Machina would no longer exist. I mean, some people still might consider it Deus Exi, but remember that Rinoa got blasted by the same lunar cry that the Ragnarok would have been in this scenario. So it makes sense that they'd be closest to one another in space. Either that, or maybe just have them use their GFs in space to get them closer to the ship. If monsters can breathe in space, then GFs should be able to as well. I hope that should Square Enix ever make a remake of Final Fantasy VIII, they make this specific change to the story. All other story moments I believe are forgivable, but this one is not. Like, I know there are some negative story elements in this Final Fantasy, but are they really as bad compared to other FF games? I don't think so. This specific one is just so bad that I think it makes the other mistakes in this game seem just as bad, when in reality, they aren't anything worse than the rest of the series has to offer. A lot of people complain about the Amnesia subplot, but it's really not that bad. If that was the worst writing in this game, then there'd not be that much to complain about narratively speaking, in my opinion. It's kinda dumb, don't get me wrong, but what about the scene in FF9 where Zidane goes through and gets over his identity crisis in less than 10 minutes? It's a tense scene, but it gets over so fast it feels like nothing really happened, so I include it. Like, I love and hate that moment in Final Fantasy IX. It has the best BGM in FF9 in my opinion, but then they rush through it. But since that was the only real major narrative issue in Final Fantasy IX, I think most people are willing to just ignore how rushed it was. There's also the moment that spoilers happen in Final Fantasy VII. This scene would have been perfect. It's an extremely emotional moment, and at that time everyone watching it feels a heavy weight on their hearts, but if you analyze it, does it really make sense? Why can't you just cast a life spell or use a Phoenix Down? Because they only worked on knocked out party members instead of dead ones? Then why do they work on undead enemies? To compare, in Final Fantasy V, Galuf literally uses his own life force to try and fight the final boss. Him using his life energy to fight is why he ends up dying with no way of coming back. So it kinda makes sense in that game. In Final Fantasy X, when people die, their bodies disappear and their spirits are supposed to get sent to the far planes, so you know exactly when it's too late to use a Phoenix Down or life on a downed person in that game. Their bodies would have disappeared. Sometimes. I mean, sometimes there's dead people and they haven't become fireflies yet, but that's what's supposed to happen. There are some scenes in FF10 where they forget their own narrative rules, but again, most people see these scenes and just ignore them because the rest of the game is so good. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that most Final Fantasy games have issues in their narrative, and people completely ignore them because, you know, overall the games are really good. I think the only part of the narrative of FF8 that is more egregious than any of the rest of the series is the Ragnarok Deus Ex. All other narrative issues are no worse than anything else in the series. As such, the Ragnarok is the one that needs to be changed the most. As far as overall stories go for Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy VIII is the most romance-focused game in the series, with Final Fantasy X being an extremely close second. Now, I can understand people not liking the game simply because they don't like romance as a genre. I completely understand that people have different preferences. Maybe you see the name Final Fantasy and expect a fantasy RPG adventure about going out and saving the world, which is what you do in Final Fantasy VIII, but the romance plot is the focus of the overall plot of the game. I can understand people not liking it, and maybe it would be better if Final Fantasy VIII was a spin-off rather than a mainline game. That way people wouldn't come in with the presuppositions they would have for a mainline game, and maybe they're right. I'm of the opinion they should have released Final Fantasy XI as Final Fantasy Online, and Final Fantasy XIV should have been Final Fantasy Online 2 or something. Also, I wish they would have kept Final Fantasy XV as a spin-off, as no one expected Final Fantasy to become an open-world action RPG series anywhere along its lifespan. Don't get me wrong, that game's pretty great, but it doesn't feel like it's a Final Fantasy game to me. And maybe that's the same feeling some people had towards Final Fantasy VIII. It was less of a fantasy game and more of a realistic one. If you don't like romance, then I understand why you wouldn't enjoy the game. If you just didn't like how different it was from previous Final Fantasy games, then I recommend maybe coming back to it and retrying it. Just think of it as a mainline spin-off game, which is how I consider Final Fantasy XI and XIV, and 15. I just pretend that 13 doesn't exist at all. What I'm trying to say is, Final Fantasy VIII is a very different game from the other games in the series, so you should try the game again without comparing it to any of the other games in the series, and judge it just based off of its own merits. Now, for those of you who don't mind the romance-centric plot to Final Fantasy VIII but think it's written poorly, I do have to disagree with you. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying that I disagree. If you listen to what I have to say and still think that the romance sucks, then that's fine. but I will explain why I think the overall love story is good in this game. Not just Squall's and Rinoa's, but Laguna's as well. Laguna was originally in love with Julia. He had been visiting her several times prior to the game's beginning, and they became enamored with one another. However, Laguna was sent off to the front lines where he suddenly disappeared. It was during this time that Julia fell into depression and wrote the song Eyes on Me and was consoled by General Caraway. She gave birth to Rinoa and then died in a car accident while Rinoa was very young. This is only explained in a menu item for some reason, by the way. Laguna, on the other hand, ended up in Windhill, getting close to Rain and being a surrogate father for Alone. Here you actually see Laguna is really good with children, and being near Rain, the two get very close and eventually get married. It's a bit of a different story than with Julia, whom he admired from afar, but didn't get overly close with her. With Rain, however, he lived alongside her and Alone for months, and they basically became a family before Laguna ever actually proposed to her. Eventually, Alone was kidnapped, and Laguna went to go rescue her, not knowing that Rain was expecting a child. During complications in childbirth, she passed away. While it's never explicitly stated, Squall is Laguna's child, Rinoa is Julia's. While Laguna and Julia never ended up together, their kids continued their parents' romance. I think it's rather poetic. Like, romance isn't my forte, but it certainly left a pretty positive impression on me. And unlike 50 Shades of Grey, it didn't lure people in by being literary porn. Rinoa and Squall are polar opposites in terms of personality. Rinoa is extremely extroverted, and it would be an understatement to say that Squall is extremely introverted. They work well as a foil to one another. Rinoa is much more passion-driven, whereas Squall is far more logic-based. It's only through Rinoa forcing herself into Squall's life that he begins to open up to the rest of his party as well, and he grows to become a strong leader. Squall's philosophy in the game is that he's a loner, and that's for the best, as it means he doesn't weaken himself by relying on others. We learn later that he only believes that because he's too scared of what others think of him, but if he's not close to them, then there's no reason for him to care. It's a logical conclusion to come to, but people can't just live in solitude their whole lives, or else it tends to wear down the mind. We are social creatures, and it's through Rinoa, Squall begins to become a more complete person, as he has a paradigm shift, learning to rely on others if necessary. And unlike with Keistis, Rinoa teaches this to Squall through experience rather than just saying it. They get closer as they work together, and they argue because they are completely different from one another, but they both seek the same goal. For the most part. As Squall interacts with her more and more, he begins to talk more and more. Eventually, the change Rinoa caused in Squall causes Squall to fall in love with her. Rinoa, on the other hand, doesn't start out loving Squall, but it's through his acts of heroism that she begins to fall for him. I think the initial draw was when she was being eaten by the lizard statues and Squall comes in to help her. Again, I have no idea how she's still alive by the time he gets to her, but she is. Squall rescuing her is what causes her to begin to fall for him. Prior to this, she just couldn't understand his view on life, even yelling at him about how he treats the others around him and about his response to Cypher's execution. I think it's here that Rinoa begins to see Squall's side of things and begins to understand his way of thinking, which is why she ends up falling for him. Love isn't some Hollywood flick where a young independent woman in a broken relationship finds a charming and charismatic man that steals her from her fiancé and they live happily ever after. How can a person even call that love to begin with? Love is when you work beside someone towards a common goal, and you both cause each other to grow over the course of being together. Flirting and teasing help, and there are actually some scenes in the game that have Squall and Rinoa teasing each other. My favorite being if you bring Rinoa with Squall to the garden instead of to the missile base with Selphie, you can tell Dr. Katawaki that she's your girlfriend. Rinoa gets excited and goes, "Are you being serious right now?" And Squall goes, "Yeah, I'm being serious." Seriously joking. And I absolutely love that. And it's completely missable if you don't bring Rinoa with you here. Now the thing is, Final Fantasy VIII does give the player a lot of choices that actually are pretty good game design wise. It changes some dialogue trees depending on what you say, but for the romance in the story to work, you need to see enough of the scenes like this. I mentioned this earlier, but I think to improve the romance in the story, Square should have either removed a lot of the dialogue choices and just had Squall say what they wanted him to say, or they should have added more mandatory dialogue to support the romance in addition to keeping the dialogue choices he has. I'd prefer the latter option personally. I really like that they tried to give the player a choice in the dialogue, and how you get different dialogue that tells different stories depending on what you choose. It's just that for the romance plot, the romance needs to be developed. and a lot of people might just choose the ellipses options the whole game, which results in a very weak romance plot, which is vital to the game's storyline. So I think the romance in the story is good, but you basically have to play the game choosing the dialogue options with more text. So player choice determines whether the narrative makes sense or not, which is not really the best game design. For this next section of the analysis, I'd like to go over the characters in the game. The above has already explained a bit about Squall and Rinoa, but I will add to that here. Starting with Squall, I want to talk about a few things. Firstly, if you're playing the remaster, Squall has a completely different appearance in his model than in the FMVs. This is because his original model had a different appearance, mostly in the face. I prefer the original design. I think his current appearance looks too generic, J-pop boy bandy. I know some people are going to enjoy that, but he looked much more unique in his original design. If Square ever releases a remake of this game, I really hope they go back to the initial design. Hell, I'd be down for them to use the concept art appearance with the long hair. That looks badass. Secondly, I've heard a lot of people hate on Squall for his personality. I kinda wonder if these people are extroverts and just angry that someone is introverted, which is very unfair to say the least, but I will ask this instead. How would you feel if you were in the same position as Squall? He's 17 years old and was forced to take leadership of a military academy despite never having any real leadership roles before. He was forced to now take care of every life in the garden, and any decision he made could cause people he's supposed to be shepherding to die. Squall is very against the idea of becoming a leader and talks about running away. I've seen so many people complain that Squall is indecisive or whiny over the course of the game, but tell me, how would you respond to being put in that position? At the age of 17, no less. You would experience the pressure of every decision you make, deciding the fate of hundreds of thousands of lives. Is that pressure you can handle? Like look, today's 17-year-olds live on Twitter and go through mental breakdowns when someone they don't even know halfway around the world says they hate what the other person likes. For example, I like ass more than breasts, and now at least one person in the comments will complain about me triggering the PTSD involving asses. Which I'd be interested in hearing actually, so go on ahead and do that. And if you want to judge Squall based off of 17-year-olds in the 90s when this game came out, they might be able to handle pressure better than today's, but they still would not be comfortable in Squall's position. I can handle stressful situations better than most people, but even I'd hate to be in that position myself. I totally sympathize with Squall here. I don't think he's written terribly at all. And lastly, I'd like to ask what in Squall is any different from Cloud, whom people love. They both have extremely similar personalities, to the point where they both have fucking memory issues. It was handled a lot better in Final Fantasy VII though, I totally agree, but their personalities are the exact same, at least at the beginning of the game. I don't see how anybody could like Cloud but hate Squall, unless they hate how they basically use the same character as the main character in both games. I know Nomura-san mentioned that he wanted Squall to be different from all the other games' protagonists because he wanted FF8 to be as different as possible from the other games because new ideas prevent stagnancy. A great idea, which I'm glad they went with, but if I described a protagonist as a angsty, brooding dude who talks to himself a lot with memory issues, who would you think I was talking about? I do think the rest of the characters are pretty different from other FF characters though. Speaking of those other characters, for Rinoa, she's the second most important character in the game. Most of what I want to talk about in regards to her was mentioned during the romance portion, but I will talk about a few more things here. As I mentioned, she's pretty extroverted, so she is a good foil to Squall. She talks a lot more than he does and serves to open him up during the course of the game. In addition to that, she's more similar to the player than any of the other characters in terms of experience. She grew up in a pretty good home and doesn't have much experience when it comes to fighting. She knows she wants to fight for the liberation of Timber, but she doesn't actually have any experience in actually making a difference. She's very idealistic, but has no experience to actually make her ideals reality. When it comes to her actually trying to implement any of the plans she has, it always ends up in failure, like the train card switching plan, or giving the sorceress a gift that would steal her powers. Her plans are half-baked, but she's genuinely trying to help. She just doesn't have any experience in that regard. She begins to realize that once the sorceress almost kills her with the iguanas. After this, she stays in the party, but they're clearly on a different level than her. She even brings it up in the plot that she is afraid of getting left behind by everyone. A concern that persists when she gets isekai reincarnation cheat powers and becomes a sorceress, as she is afraid everyone will fear or hate her. Despite being the most outgoing of the party members, she's the least confident in her abilities. She ends up relying on Squall and the rest of the party as she grows to accept her role as sorceress. Personally, I think this part could have used a bit more development in the story, as she seems to go from being terrified of being the sorceress to completely accepting it a bit too quickly. But in the end, what she really cares about at the point in the game is being with Squall, so it's not completely necessary, I suppose. Also, when Nomura-san designed her, he said he didn't want to make her too pretty, as he thought that a woman who was too pretty would end up being easily forgettable. A pretty based opinion if I say so myself. Also, he wanted people to remember her for who she was, not her appearance, so he drew her based off his own preferences, and apparently Kitase-san, the game's director, liked her so much that he changed the story so she could be a major player character. For the record, Nomura-san had designed her intentionally to have a romantic interest in Squall, so I guess his art did a lot more persuading than words did. Overall, most of Rinoa's development I mentioned in the romance section, so I consider her to be a pretty well developed character. She goes from being a super idealistic teenager who is going to change the world, to a character who realizes she can't just change the world that easily, and is actually just getting in the way of the others. She doesn't even have the basic skills to do such and has to work on growing to that level. And of course, she ends up getting possessed by Sorceress Ultimecia, which causes her to be forced into a position of responsibility she just realized she had no business being involved in, which is why she ends up terrified of everything come the third disc. I think it's well written as it's believable and you understand why she is the way she is. She knows the responsible thing would be for her to get her powers sealed and tries to do that despite being terrified. Luckily this doesn't happen, but the fact of the matter is that she is willing to sacrifice herself in order to save the world, which I suspect probably isn't the case early in the game. Basically what I'm trying to say is that Rinoa was too naive at first, but she ends up more mature as the game goes on. I think it's well written overall. For Quistis, I know I mentioned her being hot, a claim I still stand by, but I do think she's kind of a terrible person, at least at the beginning of the game. After she gives up on pursuing Squall, she's a much better person, but until Rinoa comes into play, she's kind of a bitch. Like she keeps using her authority as Squall's teacher to get closer to him. Even once she quits being an instructor, her last command to him is to meet her at Makeout Point in Garden's training center so she can complain to him. Squall, at this point, is still in his shell and thinks everyone needs to take care of their own problems, so he's understandably annoyed and just kind of leaves her there. He's totally in the right to do so too. She's like, "I'm your teacher, so you must come with me to this place for couples so I can vent my frustrations out on you." And then Squall meets her there and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm not your teacher anymore, we're the same rank. But now that I've got you here, it's time for me to vent to you." That would be a very awkward conversation to have. I completely sympathize with Squall at this point. Aside from this, Quistis is written decently, and she's not too important to the rest of the plot herself, but she does have the CC card group side quests, and helps out in a supporting role for Squall once he becomes the garden leader. I'd say she may have some of the weakest character development over the course of the game, so if I had to suggest an improvement, it would be that she should have some more moments in the story to help her shine more. I mean, do you see this? Or this? She's the least developed character in the main party, and that's a shame. Damn shame. For Zell, he's a hothead and always heads straight into trouble before thinking it through. It's pretty consistent the entire game, and I like that he doesn't just change magically through the game. I mean, he's the reason Cypher gets backed into a corner during the timber scene because he just blurts out where they're from, but his heart is in the right place and he tries to be helpful when he can. He's kind of arrogant and wants to be a leader, wanting to lead the squad during the assassination mission, though Squall knows he probably shouldn't be the leader due to his lack of experience. I think this was actually good characterization for Squall too, as it shows both Squall as making good decisions, and shows Zell is rather proud of his abilities, and he wants to lead though he hasn't actually been in that kind of position before. By the way, I don't mean it's negative for Zell to be arrogant, that's not my intentions. It's more like he overestimates his own abilities, but when he messes up, he usually owns up to it and tries to take responsibility. I think it makes him a pretty good character just for that. He acts kind of more important than he is, but rather than coming off as annoying, it's more adorable than anything. It's more of a defense mechanism since he's always been bullied by Cypher his whole life, so it's how he tries to make others believe he's stronger than he is. At least that's my interpretation. Other random things about Zell is addiction to hot dogs. In the Japanese version it's actually sweet rolls or something, but it has the same effect. Maybe it makes more sense in the Japanese version as Japanese baked goods are addicting as hell, but hot dogs are pretty cool. I think they fit Zell's personality more too. Nomura-san actually said that he designed Zell to be similar to a shonen protagonist, which I think basically explains everything about Zell that needs to be said. Also, Nomura-san gave Zell his tattoo because he saw a random dude on MTV whose whole body was covered in tattoos and thought it was cool. Is it a good reason? I don't know, nor do I care. I just think it's a funny story. I do think the tattoo actually works well for Zell, so I fully support this decision. Either way, it's great. I like Zell, and I think he's well written as a side character. For Selphie, she's very outgoing and energetic. A bit too much for me, but that's just personal preference. She actually has a pretty likable personality. She's more of a static character when it comes to character development, but her overall personality is fine as is. I really like the diary entries she makes over the course of the game, as it has a lot of information in the game that shows things from her perspective. It's kind of out of the way, and I had no idea it existed until I started making this video, and I found it by accident. She's happy-go-lucky, but she's also pretty mature when it comes down to it, like when she goes to Triad Garden after the missiles destroyed it. She can be a leader when necessary, and I don't think it comes off as too random or anything. She even has some good dialogue involving the missile-based mission depending on who you bring with you there. Some of the people wonder if Squall didn't mind sacrificing them, but Selphie goes, no, Squall chose us because he trusted us, which shows she's a really honest and good person. Also, she's a transfer student to Bellum Garden, so she acts as a good tutorial device, allowing Squall to explain how the garden works. There's no reason for Squall to just explain this to the player in a natural way, since Squall should already know how garden works, like why randomly explain it, right? But with Selphie having just transferred in, it has a more natural reason for Squall to give a tutorial. Squall showing Selphie around garden is the tutorial for the player. You can just skip it if you just tell her that you're too busy, which is also nice. I wish other games let you skip the tutorials. So, Selphie is not the most interesting written character maybe, but definitely not the worst in my opinion. Again, she is a static character, so she doesn't develop too much over the course of the game, but she's also just a supporting character, so that's fine. For Irvine, like the other supporting characters, he doesn't change too much over the course of the game. I mentioned it a few times already, but I absolutely love how the game never tells you the reason why he can't take the shot at the sorceress is because he sees her as his mother. It's fantastic. The only way I'd fix that scene is if you wanted to also fix the amnesia scene in order to foreshadow it with a line of dialogue going something along the lines of, oh, I can't pull the trigger. Not on her. Or something like that. That's not really about Irvine's character, more about the amnesia subplot, but still. Him being a playboy is kind of annoying, but it's annoying in an understandable way. Like his character is meant to be like a perverted best friend type that you would see in anime. Characters that are meant to be annoying, but endearing at the same time. I think he's a good guy, but he tries to hide it with his personality. He has a lot more attachment to the orphanage than the others because he's the one that remembers it all. But all the people he grew up with completely forgot about him, but rather than being mopey about it, he tries to reinsert himself into their lives. He just goes about it in a less than chivalrous manner. Actually, it's funny, since he refuses to play cards with anyone other than girls. However, almost every other citizen in this game will play cards with you, even when the lunar base is about to fucking blow up. For Cypher, I like him as Squall's rival. His dream ever since he was a child was to grow up to be a sorceress's knight. He believed himself to be a knight of justice, but he never actually grew up to make his dream anything more than a childish endeavor. Truthfully, he's just super tunibio. By the end of the game, Squall is the sorceress's knight, not Cypher. Cypher, in his pursuit of his dream, ended up being the villain of the story. I admit it wasn't entirely his fault. Zell shouting out that he was from Garden when he took the President of Galbadia hostage put him into a position he couldn't escape from. Ultimecia was his only way out. She was also controlling his matron, so of course he'd accept being her knight. Ultimecia used his childish dreams to control him to do a manner of unspeakable acts like torture, and he justifies it with a, "From my point of view, the seed are evil." He's very emotionally based, which is also a good comparison for Squall being logically based. He's really held back by his emotional immaturity. He can't become a real sorceress's knight, as he's too busy chasing his toony notion of what a sorceress knight is. A sorceress's knight is supposed to both protect the sorceress but also prevent them from becoming corrupt. As long as he works under one, he doesn't care what they do. He could never be a real knight as long as he didn't stand for justice. But he will twist everything around as being just as long as he is able to pursue his dream. Not only that, but Ultimecia grooms him harder than a Discord moderator. And as the game goes on, Squall becomes everything Cypher wanted to become, but only when he finally loses to Squall in his last fight does he finally let go of his immaturity and is finally able to grow up. Alright, time for the main villain of the game, Ultimecia. While she is the main villain of the game, through the first half of it you think it's Adia. It's really Ultimecia speaking when Adia is speaking and you just don't know it yet. So it's kind of weird since it feels like they built up a Dia, and you suddenly have to switch to saying, oh no, they developed Ultimecia, not a Dia, but then they never give her a full explanation of why she is doing what she's doing. This is kind of a narrative issue that I wish that they had explained better. Why does Ultimecia seek time compression? Why did she need to go further back in time to Adele's childhood? How does time compression work in general? I really wish that they would explain some of those questions, or at least give hints and allow the player to infer them. I think the way time compression works is that it compresses time between 2 points. I first heard this theory with the Resident Arc YouTube channel, and I really like it. It makes sense to me. Why else would Ultimecia need to go back to a specific point in time, when she could just time compress the whole timeline to 1 point regardless? That wouldn't make sense unless it had to be from point A to point B, you would think, but the game suggests otherwise. Next, what is Ultimecia's real goal? In the Japanese version of the game, she essentially wants to become the only one thing in existence, which I guess means she would become the god of the world, and could recreate it to her liking, which I assume means basically she wants to do what Hein did, but quote-unquote better. There's nothing in the game actually stating this though. Instead, the game just states that somehow Ultimecia learned her fate was to be killed by a seed, so she was going to compress time to stop that. Not sure how that would work, as that would mean whatever seed ends up killing her would exist at the same time as her, which is literally what kills her. That seems like an obvious flaw in her plan, so I don't like it, and a part of me likes what the fans came up with instead, even if the word of God said it was incorrect. I am, of course, referring to the fan theory that Rinoa is Ultimecia, which I really wish was canon. So, let's talk about this theory. Yoshinori Katase-san has already said that this is not the case, but proponents of the theory still argue against him. Now, I am far more willing to believe Katase-san over fan theory since he was the game's director. Regardless, since this is an analysis video, I do suggest making this theory canon in order to make the story deeper. What is this theory? Well, there are a lot of people who believe that Ultimecia is actually Rinoa, who has gone insane after Squall has died. There's a theory that Squall is dead, but that's a bit separate from this one. This could be Squall dying any time after the game and caused Rinoa to become depressed, which she couldn't get over and became so distraught that she lost her mind. She is seeking time compression either because she no longer wants existence to be if she can't be with Squall, or maybe she was seeking to be in a time period with Squall, but ended up losing her sanity along this process, and now just seeks time compression because that was the only driving force she still had in her mind, having forgotten her actual reason due to her missing sanity. So, why did fans rally behind this theory? What was their evidence in support of it? Well, the Japanese name for Ultimecia is Ultimecia, which is very similar to the Greek name Artemisia. Both Ultimecia and Artemisia can be valid interpretations of the Japanese name, and when Final Fantasy VIII was translated into the West, the translation team didn't get any translation notes from the Japanese team. In fact, the translation team had to use a game chart to go through each line of code that way in order to translate things, missing a lot of implications in the scenes had they received the proper documents to begin with. Overall, I think the translation team did an amazing job, all things considered. Anyway, Artemisia II is a woman who lost her mind after the death of her husband, who was also her brother, a fun fact if you're into that kind of stuff. She built the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which is a massive tomb dedicated to her late husband, which proponents of this theory for Final Fantasy VIII state is similar to Ultimecia's castle in the game. That part may be a bit of a stretch, but I do think the Artemisia romanization of the Japanese name is definitely an interesting bit of information that seems pretty likely, especially considering the translation difficulties I mentioned. Another reason for this theory is due to the location of Ultimecia's castle. Rinoa and Squall share a moment at the flower field at Adia's orphanage just before going to fight Adele and triggering time compression. They promise to meet back up at the orphanage if they were to ever be separated for any reason. Now, the game states Ultimecia's castle is anchored to the orphanage probably due to the party having a strong connection to the location, but it was just a conjecture by a party member that was the case. And there's a Chekhov's gun argument to be made there, so keep that in mind, but at the same time, let's discuss what the theorists state. Maybe the actual reason the castle is there is because Rinoa wanted to meet a deceased Squall so badly she went to the orphanage in hopes of meeting him, and stayed there as her sanity began to slip away. She built the castle during this time, and that is why the castle is located there. Also, it was at this flower field that Rinoa makes Squall promise to kill her should she become possessed again, which fortunately never happens in the rest of the game and is most likely a just-in-case scenario. But again, it never comes back up in the game, so why mention it? Another Chekhov's gun situation. Those in favor of this theory will state that although the game doesn't explicitly state Ultimecia is Rinoa, just like with most of the game, it's implied here as Squall ultimately does go and kill Ultimecia, keeping his promise with Rinoa. Kind of. Squall actually refuses to kill Rinoa if she gets possessed, but in this case, he wouldn't know Ultimecia's true identity, and it brings this scene back into the story, Chekhov's gun being fired, that is. Wait, do people know what I mean by Chekhov's gun? Let me give a brief summary. If you mention something in the story, make sure it's there for a purpose. If you mention a bartender in the story has a gun at his bar, make sure he uses it. Otherwise it's just fluff and unnecessary for the story. You can Google it for a better explanation, but that's the gist of it. Also, when Rinoa was with Squall and Ragnarok, while they were still in space, Rinoa mentions how she doesn't want a future, but for the present to stand still. Well, guess what? If she's Ultimecia, she could be seeking that very thing. Another moment is with the ultimate GF during the final boss fight. Ultimecia will summon a GF in the form of Squall's ring with its name. Proponents of this theory will use this as evidence to support it, but I do want to mention that Ultimecia makes it clear that she can influence the minds of others, so she just read it from Squall most likely. Another semi-pro for this theory is that some people believe that Rinoa and Ultimecia look similar, Ultimecia looking a bit older. I think that's somewhat true, but I mean, they shared the same character designer, so it's not very supporting of the idea by itself. However, Rinoa does have white wings under motif, whereas Ultimecia has black ones, so maybe Rinoa's wings turned black when she lost her sanity. It seems like a stretch to me, but it is a possibility. Now, time to talk about the issues with this theory. And by that, I mean, let me bring back up what I stated already, as it is a massive detracting factor. That being that Katase-san has mentioned that this theory is not correct. I did mention this one earlier, but I'm mentioning it again, because it is a huge detriment. His word is effectively gospel, so it's probably best to consider this theory non-canon simply due to his opinion on it. He had a huge influence over Final Fantasy VIII. However, I really like this theory, so I hope they will reverse this statement eventually. Another counter to this theory is, if Ultimecia Rinoa wants to revive Squall, why is she trying to kill him? Why doesn't she recognize him? Now the counter-argument to this is that Rinoa has gone so far insane that she only remembers she is pursuing time compression, not the reason why she's seeking time compression to begin with. I think this counter-argument does make sense. It's a trope you see somewhat often in fiction, so I'm not going to say it's bad, but with that we've already covered most of the other cons to this theory. Now the question is, why am I theory crafting in an analysis video? Well, part of the analysis is to suggest ways to make the game better. Out of all the theories for this game, this is the only one I actually think should be made canon to improve the overall narrative. How I would change the game would be by making this theory canon, but actually put more support for it in the game. Add more evidence to support it, or just come out and say at some point that it's true. Maybe add a couple extra scenes in the end of the game showing this. The idea would be, everyone except for Squall made it back to their time. Squall, however, went further back to meet his matron, Adia, a decade prior to the game's plot. Rinoa would remember Squall, she being the sorceress of that time period. Everyone else would forget about Squall, wondering what Rinoa was talking about, since Squall was lost to space-time. She begins to feel isolated, resulting in her slowly losing her sanity. She uses Dr. Odine's research to either move her consciousness to later sorceresses, which I think is what Adele was trying to do with Alone. I might be wrong on that, but why else would Adele need a specific successor if she didn't intend to have her accept her consciousness? But anyway, Rinoa would persist into the future in that manner. Sorceresses usually live the same amount of time for a normal human, but in this case, Rinoa would need to have some way to prolong her life and last into the future. I prefer the idea of her grief being so strong that when she has a successor, her will consumes that successor. I don't think Rinoa and Ultimecia's appearances are similar too much, so that's why I prefer this method. Rinoa is seeking a way to bring Squall back into being, which is why she decided to pursue time compression. She knows about Alone's power because she knew Alone back in her original lifespan. So she tries to get Dr. Odine's machine developed to send her back in time. But it takes so long that her sanity continues to slip as she's desperate to encounter Squall again. Also, she keeps sending her consciousness into newer sorceresses over and over, which might cause some mental damage each time. Not sure how they would show that in game, but whatever. She builds her castle at the orphanage due to that being where she promised to meet Squall again in case they ever got separated. but by the time she can implement her plan, her sanity is completely gone. The rest of FF8 takes place in the same manner, and when Squall is fading into space-time, Rinoa is able to meet him. Of course, the question is, why did Rinoa suddenly show up to save Squall so randomly in the boundaries of space-time? In this scenario that I'm proposing they make canon, after defeating Ultimecia, everyone ends up back in the boundaries of space-time, including Ultimecia. Ultimecia, being at the end of her life, goes to find a successor, that being Adia, but then she and Squall both end up back in space-time. Maybe they could add a scene that when Ultimecia passes her powers to Sorceress Adia, she fades away and a younger Rinoa appears. Her sorceress powers are gone, so now she's back to her original human form, or something along those lines. Whether she remembers being Ultimecia or not does not really matter. It'd be nice to just keep people guessing here. But this way, it makes the story the exact same, but actually gives a reason for Ultimecia pursuing time compression. Like a legitimate reason, since her reasoning in-game is basically non-existent. It's just, I'll do it because I can. If they ever remake Final Fantasy VIII, which is one of the biggest ifs in gaming, I know, then they should make this canon in the manner I've suggested. Also, this would explain why Rinoa was searching space-time for Squall at the end of the game. As is, Rinoa suddenly rescues Squall for unexplained reasons. But in this situation, Rinoa would lose her sorceress powers to Adia, end up back in the borders of space-time at the same moment as Squall, and then would be able to bring his consciousness back with her to the true timeline. Also, the idea behind time compression would be it only compressing time between points A and B, as I mentioned being a better explanation for time compression earlier. The reason which should be added to the game is that, in order to bring Squall back into space-time, Ultimecia Rinoa would need to compress all of time in which Squall existed, so she would need to go back to a time before Squall existed. That would be why she was seeking a loan. It's not that she specifically needs to go back to Adele's childhood, so maybe that part can be changed, but since Ultimecia can only possess women, presumably, it'd either be Adele or Adia again. Since Adele is already a sorceress and Adia lost her powers, it makes sense for it to be Adele. I know none of this is canon, but what I'm saying by mentioning all of this is that I hope they will make it canon, at least if they remake the game. Please. It fixes some of the weaker elements without changing anything major to the story. Okay, I think that's enough with theory crafting. While I think the improvements I've mentioned would substantially improve the narrative of the story, there's other positives in this game that I'd like to mention that I think are really good, and I think that many people might have missed. For example, there are so many scenes in this game which have multiple versions depending on how you play the game. I mentioned most of these already, but let me bring it up again. They actually have different points of view and such depending on which versions of the scenes you see. Squall and Rinoa at the concert in Fisherman's Horizon, Ward being available when Laguna does his Ruby Dragon film if you don't read Timber Maniacs number 9 prior, which Selphie will say is strange, Ward is missing at that dream sequence in her diary if you do. Zell's romance with Pigtails, and a lot more. In fact, let me go ahead and break down Zell's romance side quest to show just how much hidden content this game has that so many people probably missed. Actually, I mostly want to talk about the side quest because, as I mentioned earlier, I had to replay almost the entire game for 10 seconds of footage, which seemed like a waste. I had initially left this out of the analysis, but I think it's a good example of what I really like about the hidden content in this game. I mean, I have all this footage now, so why not use it? So, upon starting a new game, but before doing the Fire Cavern, if you explore the garden, you will end up going to the library and meet the librarian with Pigtails, whom I have just been calling Pigtails all this time. This event just seems like a generic NPC banter, but it actually builds up the hidden romance meter with Zell. Upon graduating and becoming Seeds, Squall and company are assigned to their Timber mission. Before departing, if you move the party to the library and talk to Pigtails again, she will have a scene with Zell. And again, during the missile attack on Garden, if you go to the library, she will give you an item. If you have Zell in your party, she gives you a Mega Phoenix. Otherwise, she'll just give you a remedy. I like in this scene that she specifically hands the item to Zell. After the missile attack, there's another scene with a conceited Seed, who probably has a crush on Pigtails, but Pigtails is head over heels in love with Zell and gets teased by her friends for it. Talking to her after the scene shows she's scared Zell wouldn't like the bug she picked out for him. After this encounter, you can keep entering the library until the conceited Seed spawns at the counter. Here, it basically confirms that he's trying to woo Pigtails, but if you speak to the library committee, you can see that they're all trying to get Pigtails and Zell together. When you control Irvine at the Fisherman's Horizon section of the game, you can go back to the library and speak to Pigtails again for another scene of Pigtails asking about Zell. Also, I just want to note that during this time, you can continue on with another hidden side quest at Fisherman's Horizon, but since that's a different quest entirely, I'm going to skip that for now. Once Balam Town is liberated, visiting the library again shows another scene where the library committee is trying to get more information about Zell for Pigtails. I'm pretty sure she is unaware of her friend's meddling. Zell shows he's actually really shy about things involving romance, which I really like for his character. He's a hothead, but a lot of that is just him trying to cover his own insecurities. After the Battle of the Gardens, you can make your way back to the library in Balam Garden for another scene. Actually, every guide I found online said you had to do this prior to the Battle of the Gardens, but I could never get it to fire off. So I just continued on with the game and got it to fire off immediately when I got Zell in my party in just 3. Pigtails' friends are training her to know all about Zell's favorite things. It kinda reminds me of those old school dating sims, where you have to memorize random facts about a girl and then regurgitate them in order to increase her affection. But instead of memorizing them, you just use a guide. Though in this case, the guides are Pigtails' friends, and Zell's just listening in on the conversation like a creep. At this point, you will be introduced to the love meter, which finally reveals just how much the hidden romance meter has increased, up to 5 stars. The number of stars is dependent on how often you have visited the library. It also gives a romance spot at which you will eventually conclude the side quest. But before that, the game wants you to go to Adia's orphanage. Afterwards, go into the library and speak into one of the library committee members, has them asking Zell if they've seen Pigtails. She's been looking for him to go give him something. Again, just like those old school dating sims. If you go to the town of Balam, a girl at the front of town will tell Zell that Pigtails came to visit him a few days ago. Going to his house, he gets confused as his mother has no idea what he's talking about when he asks. Now you can go to the Balam Hotel to conclude the side quest. I'm not going to share the conclusion to this event, but Zell does get a good item as a result. Other special scenes in the game which I haven't mentioned would be like how casting Confuse on either Biggs or Wedge and waiting for them to attack each other results in some unique dialogue as well during the prison fight. On the Triad Garden basketball court, Irvine shoots baskets during the cutscene. Depending on how many combat victories you've had up to this point, the scene will change. If you have less than 200 victories, he misses. If you have between 200 and 250 victories, he makes the shot clearing nothing but net. If you have over 250 victories, the ball bounces off the backboard and then scores. If you give the wrong answer to Watts when arriving in Timber for the first time, he almost gets ran over by the train when he crosses the tracks. Another show of love is during the Galbadian occupation of the town of Balam. Depending on who you bring in your party in addition to Zell, they will all have unique dialogue with him upon entering his room for the first time. Irvine freaks out over his antique gun collection. Keistis asks about his keyboard that should have been confiscated before the Timber mission. Also, it talks about how he wrote his keyboard into the women's restroom, because of course he did. I won't mention the others and leave that all for you to experience yourself if you're interested. You gotta keep some mystery in it, you know? Personally, my favorite interaction is with Zell and Rhinoa in the party. But it's the stuff like this that I love in this game. And stuff like that I love in a lot of games, like Rune Factory 4, which was what my last major video was about. Maybe not everybody cares about stuff like this, but it gives the game a lot more life. I know it's all just small detail stuff, but I think a lot of people may have missed it while they played the game, and they might have enjoyed the game more had they been aware of it. Also, every GF after E3 is optional, so anything involving the others is also extra content that they fleshed out for the player to get. Several GFs are drawable, but several also have their own dungeons and side quests involving them. The world is very vast with lots of love put into it to make it feel like there's a lot of content to experience outside the main story, and you can do this while listening to one of the best soundtracks in the series. Now, with all that said, I think it's time I talk about gameplay. Initially, I had this section before the plot synopsis, but then I realized that no one would watch the rest of the video if this part, which isn't that interesting, came first. So instead, I'm putting it here. One of the most common complaints people have about this game is the junctioning system. In their defense, the tutorials for this game are bad at best. Ignore them. Instead, listen to me explain this. Firstly, let me explain how magic works in this game. Magic is similar to items. Instead of having MP or mana, you have a stock of a spell, similar to how Potions Tint and Phoenix Downs work. So, how do you get magic? Well, that leads into the next topic. The summons in this game are called GFs, which, of course, stands for girlfriend. There's a bunch of monster boys and girls in this game, and you form contracts with them in order to get them to journey with you. Unfortunately, the world wasn't prepared to consider the relations between humans and monster girls, so the game changed what GF meant to Guardian Force. You equip GFs, and they learn skills via ability points you get from battles, similar to the job system in Final Fantasy V. You tell your GFs which abilities you want them to learn, and after battles, they will gain AP, which will go to learning that skill. One of these skills all GFs have is called Draw, which lets you absorb stocks of magic from an enemy, up to 100 for a specific spell. Or even better, you can tell your GF to learn abilities that let them convert items into magic, and use that to get your stocks of magic. I've heard a lot of complaints from people in regards to how the drawing system works. They seem to not know you could just get magic from converting items, like some weird alchemist transmuting your potions into cures. This cuts down on the grind substantially. Once you get magic, you can equip your stocks of magic to your stats based off of what abilities your GFs have. For example, Ifri comes with the Strength Junction ability. You can equip your stocks of Cure, Fire, or whatever to the strength stat of whomever Ifri is junctioned to. This will in turn increase the character's strength by a substantial amount depending on how many stocks of that spell you have. Higher tier spells and higher quantities of that spell will increase stats by more, and different types of spells affect certain stats differently. For example, Curago or Regen may increase your HP by several thousand, but not increase your strength that much. Firaga or Flare would boost your strength more than a healing spell would, but they wouldn't increase HP that much in comparison. One thing I like to do in this game when playing is buy 10/10 to the town of Balam right at the start of the game, and using a certain GF's life magic refinement skill to convert them into Curagas, and equipping Squall's HP with them, resulting in him having almost 5,000 fucking HP within the first hour of the game. Think of Junction as just meaning equip. Later, GFs give you status defense and attack, or elemental defense and attack slots. This means you could equip a status effect spell to your attack to make your normal attacks have a chance of inflicting that status effect on your opponent. Equip 100 blinds to Squall's status attack, and he will have a high chance of inflicting blind on your opponents, similar to how he and Cypher try to blind each other in the starting FMV of the game. Equipping the blinds to Squall's status defense makes him immune to blind, which I'm certain he wished he did prior to the aforementioned training session with Cypher. Similarly, if you equip Thunder to Squall's elemental attack, this will cause his normal attack to deal thunder damage. Equipping the spell to his elemental defense will reduce the damage from Thunder. In certain combinations, you can even get a character to absorb damage inflicted by these types of attacks. Squaresoft said they really wanted people to get as in-depth into character building as they wanted. If you are super into min-maxing, this game will be your oyster. If you aren't interested in it at all, you can just use the auto-junction setting in the game. Bringing up all this, it would be good to talk about the game's balance. Enemies in the game scale to your active party's average level. Higher level monsters result in higher tier spells if you're interested in that. But it's generally better to stay at a lower level. The reason being, since you can get spells from items, you can completely outclass enemies using items for your junction magic instead of leveling up normally. If it's your first time playing the game, I would suggest just playing as you wish. But if for some reason you are having issues with the game systems, you can keep this in mind. Rather than leveling up, you can just rely on junctioning. There are other reasons for staying low level, such as if you want to min-max your stat gains, but you really don't need to worry about that when you're casually playing the game. The only people who would worry about that are people who already like the game a lot, I would think, and this video, while they might enjoy it, is targeted more towards the criticism this game has received over the years. So you might think that if this game's designers were smart, they'd prevent you from getting extremely powerful items early on to avoid being overpowered at the beginning of the game. And you'd be right actually. You normally wouldn't get any late game items unless you specifically went out of your way to level up, which results in you fighting stronger enemies, maintaining the balance of the game. However, Magic the Gathering took the world by storm and got really popular at the same time in Japan as when this game was being developed. As such, the world of Final Fantasy VIII has an internationally recognized minigame called Triple Triad, which is essentially the Final Fantasy equivalent of a trading card game. You can play this minigame with NPCs around the world, which almost every NPC throughout the world will play cards with you regardless of the circumstances. It's actually quite hilarious. Even during a fucking prison break, you can run up to the prisoners and play this minigame with them, and I guess the prison wardens just, out of respect for the game of course, completely ignore any transgressions you are doing during the sequence of the game, and just allow you to continue playing. The thing about this game is that you can get at least one of your opponent's cards when you win the game. There's also a GF with the ability called Card Mod, which transmutes cards into items. These items can be used to create spells from mid to late game. The amount of time you invest in this TCG minigame will determine just how unbalanced FF8 will be. For example, you can duel so many people as soon as the game begins that you can have many required ingredients to make Squall's ultimate weapon. This weapon unlocks Squall's ultimate limit break, which is the strongest physical attack you can do in the game. This takes anywhere between 2 to 4 hours of just grinding cards in the first area of the game though, which I could never in good conscience actually recommend. I've done it once and thought, wow, I accomplished my goal, so now what? As I steamrolled through the entire game afterwards. Also, I mentioned them earlier, but for those who do not know what limit breaks are, they're used in a few Final Fantasy games, but they're essentially a type of desperation attack where, at least in FF8, if your character's HP is about 1/3 of its maximum value, they get a special command. Like technically there's a hidden crisis counter that determines when a character can use their limit break, but essentially if your HP is low, you'll be able to use the limit breaks. Squall's is Renzokuken, which allows them to hit the enemy several times with a type of rhythm minigame attached to it. Squall gets a critical hit for each perfect he gets in this rhythm game. He occasionally follows it up with a special attack that ranges from doing just one extra attack to the aforementioned strongest attack in the game, which hits the enemy 17 times. Final Fantasy VIII is a game all about a children's trading card game. Squall travels the world in order to collect the most rare and powerful cards, which he uses to destroy the big bad at the end of the game. You think that this is a joke, but this isn't actually far off from the truth. The card game is laid out in a 3x3 grid. Each player will have 5 cards and the total cards that they have, and then RNG determines who goes first. Each card has 4 numbers associated with each side of that card, left, right, top, and bottom. If you lay a card down next to an opponent's card, if your card has the higher number on that side touching the other card, you will flip it. Your goal is to flip as many cards as possible prior to the 3x3 grid being completely filled. If you have more flipped cards than your opponent, you win. As such, you'll normally get a reward. I say normally because, well, remember how I said this game was played all around the world in the game? Different regions come up with their own unique rules for the game. In the first area, VIII, the rule is that if you beat someone, you get one of their cards. But in another region of this game, if you beat somebody, you might get all of their cards. Completely balanced, as I'm sure you can tell. And the developers did this because they wanted to give each region a distinct cultural feel to them, which I think is a pretty nice touch. However, there's one really stupid rule in a certain area, which is called direct, in which you get any cards that you flipped from your opponent, but then they get any cards that they flipped. It's one of the dumbest rules of all, and I can only assume no one in their right mind actually enjoyed dealing with when playing this game, which results in people just not dealing with it. For you see, when you play a card game in one region, then go to another region, the people in that region will ask if you want to mix rules. Normally, you always want to cancel a card game anytime an NPC asks that. You can just keep re-challenging them until they stop asking you, and eventually, they'll just stop asking. However, if you know how to manipulate RNG, and by that I mean look up someone else online who knows how to manipulate RNG, you can force regions to mix rules, but only take on the rules you like. You can get rid of all the terrible rules in the world this way. Off the top of my head, I know Fuzzfinger Gaming has made a few videos on RNG manipulation. You can go check him out if you're interested. The card trade at the end of the match is just one of the rules that might differ between regions in game. There are some truly terrible rules, such as random, which means you don't get to choose the cards you want to use in the game. The game chooses them randomly for you. Normally, you just pick the top 5 strongest cards in your deck. Not in a region with random activated. If you don't want to use RNG manipulation but you are suffering from the random rule, I recommend using the card mod skill to get rid of every card in your list except for the ones that you really want to keep, such as the unique cards in this game that are modeled after your GFs, or your party members. Yeah, for some reason every member of your party, and some other named characters, have fucking cards of themselves in this game. It makes no fucking sense. There are also some of the rarest and most powerful cards in the game, but no one fucking questions it. Like imagine, you were playing Magic the Gathering, or Pokemon TCG, or Force of Will, or whatever. And your opponent just summons a card that's just an image of their own face and has some of the most broken stats in the game. That's what happens in this game, except the NPCs just see the card and are like, oh yeah, that's totally a legitimate card, as if nothing's wrong. What? Anyway, I think I went a bit off track. There's a ton of rules in Triple Triad, but I recommend instead of learning them all, you just use RNG manipulation to get rid of the ones you do not want. Instead of learning all the rules, just force the world to use the rules that you decide. As probably should have been the case to begin with. And don't get me wrong, it's interesting that each region has its own different rules, as it makes each region of the world have its own personality and culture, but mechanically speaking, it just hurts so much. It's like how in Persona 3, they really wanted to drive home that people are responsible for their own actions, so they make it impossible to give direct actions to your party members except for the MC himself, in order to further this theme. But it ends up making the game really annoying at times, because the AI for your partners is extremely stupid. Maybe I'll do a video on that someday. Anyway, moving on. Triple Triad is fun, but only when you have the rules you want to play with. I wish they had changed it in the remaster to let you select which rules are active from like a menu or something, but they didn't. So now you have to go and manipulate RNG to get the rules you want, like a child changing the rules of the game just so they can always win. But I mean, gambling is a sin, and it's not gambling if you stack the deck in your favor to ensure victory, right? Anyway, I think that's about all I can say about this game. Both Triple Triad and Final Fantasy VIII. I know I spoiled the entire plot of FF8. I did mention there would be spoilers, but I do want to mention that even if you've never played the game before, you should probably give it a try as long as you're into JRPGs. I still think that the game is well worth playing, even if you know the plot now. Hell, you might even enjoy it more now since you fully understand why Squall acts the way he does at times. I also deliberately misrepresented several plot elements in jest, so you'll still experience some mystery in the plot. I really think people should go out and explore it a lot for themselves. Go into places and talk to NPCs. Enjoy the world that was built and have fun exploring it. And above all, go forth and enjoy Triple Triad.